Good morning, everybody. Let's get underway if we can, please.
My nephew had, who's like 14, 16 years old.
I'm Mike Daniels. I'm the chairman of the National Advisory Board for the Global Internet Strategy Project for the American Enterprise Institute. And first, I want to welcome each and every one of you here this morning. We thank you for being here. We look forward to your participation. I also want to give a very special welcome to both Senator Mark Warner and Senator Cory Gardner, who have agreed to be with us this morning, and Jeff will be talking with them, and they have an announcement to make, which I know will be of significant interest to all of you. So I want to do three quick things, and then I'll introduce Jeff. First is the Global Internet Strategy Project at this stage is a culmination of 2 years of very extensive national and international work by the group that has been running this project through the American Enterprise Institute. We have spoken with several hundred experts from every discipline and field across the globe, and you will see the results of that in the document that you have in front of you. We also have a National Advisory Board, which you will see the listing of those folks in your booklet. This is an extraordinary group of people, very former senior government officials, chief executive officers and senior business people, cyber experts, academicians, public policy thinkers at the top levels of the United States and elsewhere. We have been privileged, and we thank every one of those people who has been willing to share their time and thoughts with us over the last 2 years. I would close by saying this. It's been an extraordinary experience, and those of us who have been in the Internet business, I served in the first users group of the ARPANET when I worked at ARPA in 1969. And I ran a company in the late 1990s in the dot-com boom that was the single most attacked company on earth, Network Solutions. Most of you bought your domain name from that company. We handled .com, .org, .net, .gov, .mil, .edu, and all country codes. So I experienced what it was like in those days to be on the front lines, and continuing into the business that I do these days, I see the unbelievable magnitude of this problem worldwide. It's done nothing but grow. So what have we learned in those 2 years? We've learned that experts, ordinary citizens, those on the front lines of this battle each day and night are frustrated, are deeply concerned, and believe that what we are doing now is not working. What we have learned is that we need a different approach, and we need it now. We hope that this report will serve as a national call to action. It's very clear to us that people are trying hard at every level of government and industry, but this problem is not being solved. And when I say this problem, Jeff will talk about the 4 major areas globally that we have covered in this study. So what you will find in this detailed report are a set of recommendations that are specific for a next administration in the United States of America to hopefully do something about. Again, everybody's trying hard, but we are not solving this problem, and a set of problems is getting worse every day. So I want to introduce Jeff to you, Jeff Eisenach, Dr. Jeff Eisenach. He's done a great job of being the program director for this effort. He's had a team of people who are all listed in your booklet. You're going to hear a number of those people today on our panels. And again, I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this, and especially the National Advisory Board, who are an extraordinary group of people and have been very thoughtful in their approach to this. So on that note, let me introduce Jeff. Jeff?
Mike, thank you. I'm going to keep our preliminaries to a minimum here because we're blessed with 2 of the leaders in the United States Senate who have worked to get out in front of this issue. And I'll just say, and the only thing I'll say substantively at this instant is we decided to try to take a holistic look at this issue on the theory that there's a blind man and an elephant problem going on here. And I will tell you, the more we looked, the bigger and more complicated and faster moving the elephant became. I don't know that we've been successful in getting our arms entirely around the thing, nor do I think it's likely we ever will. But that's been our objective. And what we're here to do today is, as Mike said, lay out our thinking at this stage of the game based on what's been about 2 years of effort of trying to understand all these issues. In terms of our program, we're going to begin with our senators, who I'll introduce in a second. We'll end that portion of the program around 9:45, and I'm going to spend a few minutes at that point just trying to summarize in 10 or 15 minutes some of our main findings and conclusions. At 10 o'clock, we'll begin the first of two panels on internet freedom and digital trade. We may run just a little late on by design today, but around 10:45, we'll begin our second panel, which is on crime and critical infrastructure and national security issues. Without further ado, let me introduce our two keynote speakers this morning, and they're going to speak briefly, and then we're going to engage in some Q&A, including some Q&A with the audience, as I say, until about 9:45. First, Senator Mark Warner was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008. Many of you know that he has a technology background as an entrepreneur in the tech industry for more than 20 years before entering public service. He has been a real leader on cyber issues across the board, including chairing the first hearing in Congress in the aftermath of the Target data breach. And he's currently working with across the aisle, as he's wont to do, and we're grateful for, that there are folks still willing to do that in a difficult environment in this town. Is now working with Chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCall, to set up a commission of experts to study digital security and issues and issues around encryption and so forth. So Senator Warner is going to go first. Let me go ahead and introduce Senator Gardner. We'll get that out of the way. Senator Warner was elected to the Senate in 2014. He sits on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and he chairs the subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and international cybersecurity policy. And we're going to talk a little bit about China today. So I just think that Asian thing, the Asia Pacific and international cybersecurity thing, must not have been completely a coincidence. But he is, among other things, led the effort to impose sanctions on North Korea for its various forms of misconduct in the cyber arena and otherwise, and continues, and what really led us to Senator Gardner in the first instance was he has been a real leader in the effort to get the Obama administration to pay even more attention to the need to developing a comprehensive strategy for cyberspace, which obviously we think is a pretty good idea. So let's begin with Senator Warner and then Senator Gardner.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that introduction and for all the good work that AEI has put together in this roadmap. I think the four categories of the initial report are the appropriate ones. I want to give a particular shout out to my longtime friend Mike Daniels. For those of you who, many of you very young in the room, when he was talking about his activities back in this field back in the 80s and 90s. It is actually true. He is that old. I used to work with him back in the private sector back in those days. And so, Mike, thank you for your leadership in this space. And I couldn't be more pleased, and Cory and I will have more to say about this near the end of the panel, and some ongoing work that we're going to be doing in this space. Cory Gardner is one of the new real rising stars in the United States Senate in terms of someone who takes a broad-based, fact-based approach to the issues that, gosh knows, we all could use a lot more of here on the Hill. I mean, as we were getting ready for this, and over the last couple of years, I've spent quite a bit of time trying to go a bit deeper in cyber. I've got 20 years background in the telecom business. I've had 7 years on Intel, and it's extraordinarily complex and increasingly touches so many different parts of what we do. I think within my own personal staff, I've got 5 different staff members that in one way or the other touch cyber. There so far have been 9 separate committees in the Senate that have held hearings this year on one aspect or another of cyber challenges across the board. And again, the 4 themes that the AI work will focus on, I think, are the right ones to look at. How we recognize the wonderful value of the American leadership in the internet, how we maintain that in a world that is increasingly complex. The challenges around cyber, we know some of the top-line stats. At minimum, I think these numbers are way outdated already. $120 billion a year of economic damage. I think those are grossly underestimated as we continue to see numbers rise. We think about this, Cory, from his standpoint on armed services, mine more on intel and his on foreign relations. But as we think about kind of cyber and from a defense and offense standpoint, I mean, we really are thinking, at least my thinking is that we're talking about a totally new domain. I mean, as we've thought in the past how we compete with adversaries around the world, we normally think land, air, sea. Well, cyber is truly a 4th domain. I personally believe it needs to be elevated in terms of our military structure, but it is a domain that allows the bad actors, whether they are state-sponsored actors or simply cyber criminals, really this is already an ongoing conflict. And unlike traditional military, where we are potentially vulnerable for, terrorist acts like the horrible tragedy that took place in Orlando or one-off attacks against our nation as a country, what is happening in cyber is literally on a daily basis. The private sector is assaulted, if not hundreds of thousands, literally millions of times a day. I agree with Director Comey in that the sense that most American companies fall into either one of 2 categories: those who know they've been hacked by the Chinese, or those who don't know they've been hacked by the Chinese but still have been hacked by the Chinese. And that is going to require, because of the asymmetrical nature of this threat, I think, new thinking and new approach. I was recently on a trip in Ukraine, and the concerns from the Ukrainians of what happened in terms of the cyber attack that shut down part of their infrastructure, power infrastructure, shows the level of threat that cyber poses. At the same time, we have to recognize this presents an uneasy relationship between the public sector and the private sector. Post the Snowden revelations, we have, unfortunately, a trust gap that exists in America between private sector, between the public sector. We've seen, I believe, certain nations use those Snowden revelations as a reason to argue against American leadership in the internet space and cyber more broadly. And some of the proposals that have been offered by countries under the guise of security, sometimes simply to the advantage of their domestic industries, could literally lead to the balkanization of the internet, which, again, would make us less safe rather than more safe in terms of cyber. Jeff mentioned the fact one of the things that Cory and I are working on, and I think we'll get into this in the question and answer period, is trying to make sure that we elevate Congress's knowledge around digital security issues. The commission that we've proposed is not an encryption commission, and although that obviously is an issue of the day, it is a digital security commission because we have to take a much, much more holistic approach. And since this threat is posed both towards public sector and private sector, the idea of where the expertise is going to arise and be generated to both counter these threats, maintain these threats, at the same time maintaining the kind of basic freedom of expression and privacy issues that I think so represent and so fundamental to our American democracy, is also a challenge. And recognizing I'm not sure there's going to be one single silver bullet, nor one single entity alone where this expertise can arise. And if this is not all complicated enough, let me just say that we are at the just at the beginnings of a debate that is going to get exponentially more complicated. Most of us in this room probably remember the great movie Toy Story and Buzz and Woody. Well, as we move into the Internet of Things, think about the fact that every one of your child's toys are going to be interconnected with sensors. All that actually in itself raise questions around privacy, raise questions around cybersecurity. The notion of how much bigger an issue this is going to become in terms of a potential intrusion into our life and vulnerabilities into our life are really, quite honestly, beyond the pale. So whatever work can be done, and the one final comment I'd like to make is, the most important thing and why I'm so happy to be working with Cory on this, this is really not a question of left versus right, conservative versus liberal, Democrat versus Republican. This is really a question of future versus past. And if we get this right, to maintain America's leadership, to maintain the value of free expression, to maintain the free internet that Mike, I know, has been such a big advocate of, is going to require the kind of collaboration, cooperation, and good thinking that AEI started this morning. So thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. Mark, thanks for the good work and great work you've been doing in this area and will continue to. It's great to have somebody with the level of expertise and knowledge that Senator Warner brings to the Senate. As many senators are trying to figure out what the heck Snapchat is, Mark has been a part of the technology that's developed, cell phone technologies, and of course expanded our awareness and knowledge of information and technology and systems. That expertise cannot be, it's invaluable. So thank you very much for the work that you have done, and I look forward to our work together. To Jeff Eisnock and to Mike, the team at AEI, thanks for this report. This is something that we've been talking about now for the past several years as chairman, as I have taken the chairmanship of the East Asia Subcommittee over and added the cyber component to that subcommittee. Just want to give you a little bit of a lay of the land. The extent of the problems and its associated costs are completely staggering when it comes to cyber threats, cybersecurity. In 2014, 47% of American adults had their personal information compromised by hackers. Raise your hand if you have been one of those 47%. I think it's pretty indicative that we've seen that number increase over the past 2 years. And that's primarily through data breaches at large companies. But according to some estimates, those cyber attacks account for $120 billion in economic and intellectual property loss annually in the United States. Admiral Mullen, Governor Huntsman came out with a report just a couple of years ago talking about how many billions of dollars worth of cyber attacks that we receive each and every year, and what nation is responsible for a large percentage and portion of those attacks. A 2015 study looked at specifically the costs incurred by larger-sized organizations with the U.S. and found that the total cost of responding to a cybercrime incident averaged $15 million per incident. That's pretty incredible. When 47% of the American people have been subject to this, and to respond to such an event, the cost could be $15 million each. Now, this is in a letter that Senator Warner and I will be talking about a little bit further to our colleagues later on this morning. But this is incredible that we have these opportunities like AEI is presenting today to get this information out. When I joined the Senate, I was asked if I would chair the East Asia Subcommittee, and I said, yeah, I would, but I'd like to add to that subcommittee's jurisdiction. Let's add a cyber component, because as Mark said, land, air, and sea, and cyber ought to be the catchword that we are talking about from now into the unforeseen future, because this is with us to stay. The Defense Authorization Act that we are working on today in the House, they adopted the language to create a cyber combatant command, a standalone combatant command. That's something that the Senate has been addressing. Mark and I are both a part of an amendment to do just that. But it's elevating each and every day, each and every moment, each and every policy debate we have. The relevancy, the importance of cyber policy, cyber security. And so we added cyber to the Foreign Relations Committee. But by doing that, we created a part of the problem too, and we're going to get into this further this morning, because now we have another committee with yet another bite at the apple when it comes to cyber policy. So in addition to the Intel Committee, in addition to Homeland Security, in addition to the Judicial Committee, in addition to the Armed Services Committee, in addition to we now have the Foreign Relations Committee. So we have, of the 13 committees, we now have more than half of them with some jurisdiction in cyber that's kind of siloing off the expertise and the policy approaches that we have to what is truly a whole of government challenge. And if you look at what we witnessed in our hearings on the OPM breach, what we were told during the OPM breach by administration officials was, we just don't know exactly what the government has that needs to be protected. That's a pretty big concern. Now, that's not casting blame on anyone, but that's saying we have entered a new step, a new phase of the evolution of data and security. Some of you are too young to remember counter checks. Some of you may remember that you could go into a grocery store, grab a checkbook off the counter, fill in the check with your bank account number, and then hand the check back to the cashier. Some of you may be too young to remember that there were people who put their Social Security number on their checks that they were writing because they didn't want to show their driver's license, which also had the Social Security number on it. It just cut out the middleman, and they could just hand that to the cashier and move on with it. And yet today we have refrigerators that are sending emails to the grocery store saying, send another gallon of milk. And these are challenges that we never thought possible before. And as witnessed by this convergence of the private sector and the public sector when it comes to cybersecurity, something that this report gets into, something that we have to address from a whole of government perspective. When North Korea can break into a private company in South Korea and steal defense plans on an F-15, these are issues that we have to be aware of, we have to be prepared for, and we need a whole of government approach to do it. So I look forward to getting into these issues. The report, I think, is a very, very critical part of this debate that we will launch policies from to solve what is not a unique challenge, but a growing challenge when it comes to cyber and how the world is going to address this both opportunity and threat. So thank you.
Senator Warner, Senator Gardner, thank you. And let me ask just a couple of questions here to kind of get us moving forward. And then I know we've had a couple of references to an announcement that will be forthcoming, but we're going to tease and make people wait for that. Senator Gardner, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, I think the last 2 years, the more we have looked at the current state of affairs in terms of the set of issues that we looked at, the less encouraging it's been. Internet freedom is in decline. IP theft, as you just referenced, is continuing and increasing. Cybercrime is on the rise. Our critical infrastructure is vulnerable as we speak to attacks from both state and non-state actors. And this is an area where I don't think you can, where I don't think it's fair to say the Obama administration has not paid attention, right? I think the president, has paid more attention to this issue than any of his predecessors, and seems to have a fairly sophisticated sense of at least the state of the internet and cyberspace, which is not that common among, people in Washington, just because it's come so fast. You've talked about the need for a global internet strategy, but more broadly, why do you think we're not succeeding here? And just big picture, what do you think we need to be more successful?
Absolutely, and I think attention and action are two different things, and I think that's where we have to recognize that we do need to pay growing attention to cyber policy, cybersecurity, and we have to act on that concern and that attention. This past year, I had the opportunity to visit China and in Beijing met with the new administrator of the cyber administration in China. We talked about what they were doing to stand up their cyber, department, what President Xi had done to create a cyber committee that he placed himself as the head of and recognize the sort of importance of cyber, not as a subset of foreign relations, not as a subset of the Commerce Committee or a subset of Intel Committee, but as its own primary area of concern. And I think that's first and foremost, is recognizing that cyber is no longer just a subset of concern. It's no longer a subset of policy. It's its own policy. It's its own concern. It deserves its own attention. And that's where the report gets into recognition of so many of these important relationships that cyber has to our public policy. So how do we create the combatant commands recognizing the new concerns revolving around cyber? What we can do to acknowledge the threat that exists from North Korea, the asymmetric threat around the globe, whether it's Iran, Russia, or China, and how we respond to that. We have a 2011 cybersecurity policy that, by all accounts, was a good policy written in 2011, but that was 5 years ago now. Senator Cardin and I worked with each other to put an amendment, passed an amendment to requiring a review of that 2011 cyber strategy, where the State Department, I don't know if they came up with anything new, but it looks like they cobbled together some previous statements and speeches and research and put it together in one report saying, hey, this is what we've progressed upon in terms of the 2011 strategy. But I think that we've got to continue to push this as a department strategy at the State Department, recognizing cyber as a possibility of foreign relations tool, recognizing cyber as part of our defense structures, recognizing cyber as a transportation issue, and then to build public policy solutions around that recognition. I think we've got to push the administration to do a better job with the United Nations in terms of their efforts, member nations, and how they are going to treat internet freedom issues and how they are going to work with China and Russia to adopt a rules-based system of governance for the internet without dividing it up and the balkanization that Senator Warner referenced. How do we avoid those? How do we get these basic cybersecurity norms into international law and agreed to by some partners who have a different view of freedom and the internet than we do? How do we continue we've got to make sure that we continue to press the administration to pursue Chinese and Iranian hackers. If attention is being paid, that's great, but we still have breaches on hydro-powered facilities. We have executive orders that allow for cyber sanctions to be issued, but those cyber sanctions haven't been delivered upon. The North Korea Sanctions Act that we mentioned earlier, for the first time ever, passed mandatory sanctions regime in the area of cyber, but yet to give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt, they still have some time to comply with the terms of the act. But I hope when the 180 days are up after the passage and signing of the legislation, that we will have action identifying those actors in North Korea, and that we will go after them and pursue them. And we know that in my conversation last week, 2 weeks ago, with leadership in South Korea, that North Korea has about 6,000 actors in their cyber warforce, and many of them are acting through China. And how do we make sure that we're working with China to stop that kind of attack from coming based from a North Korean operative that's operating out of China, and to recognize the need to work together at an international level to stop that? So we have to have, I believe, a new strategy. This report gets into it and starts it. This genuinely new approach, not something that was 2011 that we look back and say, all right, here's where we tweaked it, here's where we've had successes, but a new whole-of-government approach, a new strategy that takes into account the passage of laws seeking sanctions and the passage of executive orders issuing sanctions, or at least making them available as an option, and then addressing issues like the government group of experts, group of governmental experts at the UN to create viable results with China, Russia, because they haven't done so at this point, and really concentrating on like-minded nations around the globe to come together in ways that we haven't yet to push those nations that simply aren't on the same side as we are.
So I just want to point out, you just discussed lots of the elephant, and I think the thing that strikes me about your response is the fact that and thank you for taking the time to get your arms around so much of it, because you just think of all of the things that you had to address to think big picture. What's the answer? Senator Warner, let me follow up on that. And you may want to kind of answer the same question, but also let me ask for a particular part of it. Another of the issues we've been struck by in our research is the gap, and it's sometimes pretty heated, really, between government and business in this arena. And given the fact that we're creating cyberspace together, and really business, the private sector, is creating cyberspace, That's a serious issue. There's a sense on the private side that the government's more interested in regulating and litigating against the private sector than it is in protecting it. And on the government side, I think a sense that the private sector, could be more cooperative in things like law enforcement and national security. First of all, feel free to answer the big picture question. But second of all, particularly in the context of your work with Congressman McCall, what do we do to bring the private sector and the government on the same page here?
Well, let me build first of all off of what Cory said, and I can't think of an issue where the logic of international collaboration, particularly from the West, should be so high, and we have so many shared interests here, yet we have not seen that level of information sharing, that level of collaboration that we need, number one. Number two, one of the things that is so unique about cyber is that the threat, there's nothing static about the threat. So even if we are able to defeat the adversary today, there will be a new set of challenges tomorrow. So that is going to require a level of public-private collaboration that frankly is unprecedented, and intergovernmental collaboration that's unprecedented. Cory and I have been partners on this idea of the commission that Chairman McCall originally came up with, and I'm normally not a fan of commissions. That usually becomes code for punt on the Hill. But the complexity of these issues, I've never seen anything. I've got 20 years experience in the telecom business. I was in the wireless industry, so it means I'm also the only, as Bob Dix has heard me say before, I'm the only politician that says even when I'm talking, leave your cell phones on, since I was the co-founder of Nextel. But that combined with it is extraordinarily challenging. And when some have suggested, and an answer is things like an American-only backdoor, shows, I think, not a recognition of the nature of the threat and the nature of how we address it. All that would do would push the bad guys onto Dave McCurdy, Dave, go ahead, man. Cha-ching, cha-ching, I hear it. All that would do would push the bad guys to foreign-based hardware and software. Think about this for a moment. We add 2,000 new apps a day to the iPhone store. Over half of those are foreign-based. So the idea that there's going to be an American-only solution here, it doesn't get it right. I think the framework of the question about the trust between the public sector and the private sector, I think there is candidly blame on both sides. And let me tick off two or three things quickly. I think there was a long time of concern. I say this as a former guy that's in the private sector, longer in the public sector, of, oh my gosh, if government's going to come in and regulate, they're going to mess it up. The flip side is that in cyber, Dave, go ahead and answer the phone. It's all right. The flip side is that in cyber, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So my concern is, on an industry-wide basis, if there are not some standards, and they don't need to be governmental set, you are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable entity in your industry. So how we think that through, in a way, we have to recognize the information sharing bill is a first step. I think the jury's still out in terms of how much sharing is actually going to take place. I think the jury is still out whether the legal liability and safe harbors are done correctly. You mentioned the OPM issue. We've got an awful lot of federal employees in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Huge challenges. But I think we have to bear some responsibility when we think about, for example, how the government acquires IT systems. The fact that we never go out and actually acquire and, unlike the Valley, build from scratch a new IT system, and we simply cobble on patch upon patch upon patch of governmental IT systems that make them all more vulnerable because of that unwillingness to kind of junk the old system and start from new is a challenge. I think the fact that we've got things in government contracting around low price bidding, where, as opposed to value-add bidding around IT, is the ultimate penny wise, pound foolish. So there are things around USG activities that we've got to sort through. And, an area, last comment on this question is, you made mention of the fact that we did the first hearing after the Home Depot data breach. It's crazy that after all the level of data breaches that we have, that we don't have common federal legislation. That you're going to have 47 different sets of notification if you are a data breach victim, not to have that kind of common federal standard. And quite honestly, it's going to have to be, my personal editorial comment here is, where all industries have to have some skin in the game in this. And, and we can't start carving out one industry after another if we're going to have this kind of collaboration. So, it's not going to require as much, I think, a regulatory hand as it's going to require a level of collaboration and cooperation. And honestly, a lot of that is going to have to go to this whole trust issue that, again, I think the commission that Cory and I have advocated for would be at least a step in the right direction.
Well, with that, and I think that's a perfect tee up, because I think you all have some news you want to make today. And I'll tee it up this way. 15 years ago, I served on a commission with the Kennedy School on America's national interests, and I was the cyber guy. And so we wrote a little chapter of this report that said, one of the things we need to do is we need to pass some legislation to improve information sharing between the private sector and the government in the cybersecurity arena. Well, that legislation passed last year, 15 years later. So I thought that was kind of a long lag time, and indicates that we need to get better in terms of congressional action, in terms of Republicans and Democrats and both houses working together to get things done that need to be done to make us safe and prosperous and successful in this arena. You guys have given some thought to that. I don't know who wants to go first, but we're delighted to have you talk about it here today.
Well, thank you. It's the drum rolls and bands playing in the background. Just imagine that as we make the announcement that Senator Warner and I together are launching today a Senate Cybersecurity Caucus, the first ever cybersecurity caucus in the United States Senate. This is jointly led by Senator Warner and I to really do exactly that, to bring people across the aisle together to partner and have this whole of government approach that we desperately need for this, to find information, the understanding, the knowledge, and then followed by the actions that we can implement in the United States Senate and Congress and the government to protect the incredible assets of this nation, whether you're dealing with your local community credit union and the bank account that you have there, or whether you're dealing with the most deeply regarded, deeply held secrets that the United States has within the confines of government networks to assure the protection of our people. That's something that this cybersecurity caucus can bring together to focus on, because there is no Republican 0 or 1. There is no Democrat 0 or 1. But they together, those zeros and ones, can do things that both Republicans and Democrats are very much affected by. And that's what this country has to focus on. And so can't believe that there hasn't been such a caucus in the first place. It's hard to believe there's one that hasn't been picked yet. But this one, I believe, will be the most active caucus this place has seen in a very long time.
And I would simply add one. It's great to partner with Cory on this. Our opening comments, 9 different committees that have had hearings on cyber already. Part of the job of, I think, of our caucus, and we will be soliciting our fellow members to join, is to make sure that we all get out of our individual silos. I look at this from the Intel seat. I look at this from my banking seat. I look at this from a commerce position. But this touches so many different parts of our life. And as Cory made mention, whether it's you're talking about the refrigerator or your kids' toys, as we move into the Internet of Things, the complexity of the number of devices that are going to be connected through a network bring enormous opportunities for improvement of quality of life and continued American leadership, but they also bring a whole new set of vulnerabilities that we have to think through. So, Jeff, again, appreciate the chance to build off the great work that Mike and your team has put together. But our hope is that, and on behalf of both of us, we invite your input on this. I've yet to meet the individual who I think has all the answers or has the whole sense of how large the elephant is. It continues to get larger. Our goal is hopefully this caucus will be that common ground where we can both educate ourselves and educate our colleagues about how to make sure we get this right. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. So we're almost, if you all have time for one question, we'll take one or two. So let's go right here, ma'am.
Hi, Peggy Chang with Voice of America China branch. China is one of the biggest challenges.
We're bringing a mic here. There we go.
China is one of the, or if not the biggest challenge in cyberspace for America. What are some of the ways that America can do? I mean, this is obviously a very big question that America, the government, and the Congress can do to combat this problem. It's just some of the ideas. Thank you.
Let me just make one quick comment, because a lot of this sitting on the Intel Committee, I'm not going to comment on it. But, you know, I think there is a growing recognition, I hope, that, you know, without an international regime of norms, that every country, including China itself, can be vulnerable to both state-sponsored actors and cyber criminals. And while I think there has been some progress, there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Yeah, and thank you for that. One of the things I think to answer that question and many of these questions, I've advocated for the creation of a select committee on cyber in the United States Senate. I think that's something that we need to do, just as we talk about a separate combatant command, just as we talk about having that viewpoint that can look at all committee actions, all policies at the same time. I think taking the chair and the ranking member of each committee that addresses cyber today, putting them on a select committee so that they can begin those conversations is an important step. So I would create a select committee on cyber to address China and beyond. China specifically, again, I think if you look at the conversations we're having them from a bilateral standpoint, those are important. If you look at the past the summer and the fall, the agreement that China entered into with the United States, if you ask any member of the administration today or the State Department today how that is being implemented, I think they will tell you only time will tell. But if you go to the private sector and you ask, are you still getting hacked, they will tell you, yes, we are. And so we've got to continue working with China one-on-one. But we also, again, it goes back to creating what Senator Warner and I talked about, creating that global community of like-minded, responsible nations that are interested in creating common norms that we can all abide by and adhere to, that reject the kind of use that we see right now from China and other actors. And so whether it's a commercial espionage issue, whether it's old-fashioned spy-on-spy type of activity, we have to have a better understanding of what they are doing, and we have to have an understanding from a global community that we can work together to solve and address these and pressure other nations to come together as a coalition that will abide by certain norms of behavior that we believe are the best interest of people of their nation, the people of our nation.
So we take one more back and over here.
Senator Warner, I'm with Services Connected Disabled Vet Company involved in satellite communications and cybersecurity with other companies, of course. And I've been to a number of DoD forums on this. And then through the years, it's bandied about that China is stealing 300 to 700 billion of intellectual property from us. And I hesitate to say this, and I won't say which forum it was said at, but DoD officials said that when they try to, do something about it, implement offensive cyber capabilities that we have, they're told by the administration officials, no one's been killed yet. And so they get put back in their lane, and they're not able to do anything. And, you have the most capability to understand if that's the case or if it's just saying it there.
I have no knowledge of that kind of comment made. To me, that comment sounds extraordinarily irresponsible. I would say this, to end on a slightly opportunistic standpoint as well, and whether it's a Colorado or a Virginia, I I did pretty well in cell phones. If I was starting out today in business, would be one of the sectors that we need to look at in terms of where we need to maintain American leadership. 200,000 unfilled cyber jobs in America, average salary of $88,000 apiece. We got about 18,000 in Virginia alone. If we're going to have the capabilities, defensive, offensive, otherwise, we've got to make sure we've got the flow of talent coming up, and that's going to require we've talked about all these other committees. There's a whole education component here as well, an education component in terms of training, and one of the things that I think we need to do a lot better job of, because there is not a simply USG response versus private sector response. We need to make it much, much easier for people to move from governmental to private sector and back and forth without the kind of extensive concern. I heard your, sir. I heard your question, and I believe I can't comment on whether that statement was made or not. If it was made, to me, that sounds very irresponsible.
So we're essentially out of time. Senator Warner, if there's anything you want to say in closing, then we'll go to Senator Gardner, or we just go to Senator Gardner.
No, just the fact that the emphasis that I want to come back to is, this is going to touch every part of our life. It already touches every part of our life in ways that I think people don't fully comprehend. To have seen from the business side, for example, how this has moved from a CTO and then chief legal officer up to the fact that there is not a CEO in America that cyber shouldn't be a top 3 or top 5 item on their agenda. And from a policy standpoint, from an American leadership standpoint, we've got to get this right. And my hope is that this caucus that Cory and I are going to put together will serve as that forum where we can, again, learn, educate, and recognize how many different aspects of the economy and our nation's defense it touches.
Thank you, and thanks again to AEI and for the report you do, because it's going to be a part of, I believe, a very important conversation we have going forward, because the reality of cyber means that we have to change the reality of Congress, and that's, we cannot, and the policy making surrounding Congress, the policy making surrounding the administration, and the regulations that they pursue. We can't continue to operate in a world of email when we're far beyond that email alone, because of the pervasiveness of the latency of technology and the Internet of Things and how it touches every part of our world today. So we've got to make sure that we are working in Congress in a updated, modern fashion to address the modern, updated policy threats that we face. So I look forward to using this Cyber Caucus, as well as the expertise of those of you in the room, to actually change the narrative right now, so that we can be ahead of the game instead of just reacting to it.
Senator Cory Gardner, Senator Mark Warner, thank you for being here and for your leadership on these issues. We appreciate it. I know they're there, and I've never figured out the relationship. But yeah, there's a Jeff, in fact.
You're right. You're right.
We're not actually going to take a break here, Tim? Not yet. Not yet. No, I'll call you after a second. So with that, let me step back for a second and just talk a little bit about the work that we've done through this project and our findings and recommendations, which you're going to hear more about during our 2 panels here this morning. So first of all, before I go forward, let me say, in the nature of disclaimers, if you've never been to an AEI event, let me just point out, AEI is a public policy think tank. It's nonpartisan. You've seen that. Nonprofit, educational. It doesn't take institutional positions on public policy issues. So if you were to walk out of here and say AEI supports this or AEI thinks that, that would be incorrect. What you read in our report are the views of the authors. I can tell you that the authors of the report, and I'm the lead author, and I want to thank my 4 co-authors, Mario Loyola, Jim Glassman, Shane Tews, and Claude Barfield, who have all of the good stuff in the report is their work. And I can tell you we agree on most of it. We have a National Advisory Board. I want to thank Mike Daniels for doing a fabulous job chairing that and for bringing to the table the level of people you see engaged here. I won't go into Mike's bio, but I first met him on, I think, the day that he was in the process of selling network solutions to VeriSign in the mid-1990s. He has been a leader in the tech community and the cyber community for many, many years. And all of the members of the advisory board, and I can tell you for sure they don't agree on everything. So it's been a great process for us. What we've tried to do is we've tried to learn, and I'm going to stick with this metaphor of the elephant. We've tried to understand as much about this beast as we can because it is big and powerful and it's changing our lives and changing really the world. In ways that it's very difficult even to understand, let alone try to affect or control, and yet that's the challenge we have. Before talking about that, one more set of thanks. AEI has made all of this possible for us. The level of belief in academic freedom at AEI is fabulous, and you hear people talk about my title is I'm a visiting scholar at AEI, and normally you think of that as somebody who comes in and writes articles and talks and tells you about stuff. For the last 2 years, what that has meant for me is the opportunity to be a scholar and learn. So I've been involved in cyber policy one way or another for 20-some years, but the opportunity to spend 2 years trying to understand everything that we're here to talk about today has been a tremendous gift to me. From Arthur Brooks to Kevin Hassett to Mike Strain to John Cusi, Emily Rapp, Garo Ekron, Matt Au, Judy Micah, Matt Devine, and many others who made it possible for us to be here. I want to thank them. Now, let me talk just very quickly about our findings and recommendations, and I want to start with something that's been referenced here today, but I can't emphasize it strongly enough. Cyber is power. We think of cyber as the power to communicate. It was that and still is. Today, it is the power to control. Cyber runs our banks, our power grids, our aircraft carriers, drones. It will soon be driving cars. There will be 50 billion cyber devices surrounding us within the next 5 years or so as the Internet of Things permeates everything we do. That's first. And let me be clear. The power to control the technology is the power to affect the kinetic, real world, right? And it is ubiquitous. Secondly, cyberspace, more than any other element of the natural environment, which is what we're talking about, okay? We're talking about how things work, every bit as much as the rate at which an apple falls from a tree and hits the ground, right? Every bit as much as the natural realities that we think of in the way we live our life, the density of the air that determines how an airplane flies. All of those things are also determined now in cyber. And unlike most of those things, they are infinitely malleable. They are what we make it. And we are making it and remaking it at an amazing pace. So as we think about strategy, it's not enough to think about how do we make airplanes that fly through the air that can deliver a bomb or can deliver a cargo or commercially deliver passengers from one place to another, right? We need to reimagine the air because it'll be different in cyberspace a year from now and 5 years from now. Third, the internet and cyberspace are truly global and borderless. Now, thanks to the explosive growth, really mostly of the mobile internet, in the developing world, there are more than 3 billion people connected to the internet today, and less than 10% of those, about 9% of those, are in the United States. Nearly a quarter are in China. About 45% are in the developing world. The point of that is that we being the United States, we don't get to dictate outcomes here. We may wish we could. But the simple reality of the thing is that cyberspace is getting created and used in a global environment. And our challenge is not to dictate how it works, but to try to influence and affect how it works. Fourth, the future of cyberspace, and I'm an economist, so I say this as an economist, the future of cyberspace will be determined by the economics of cyberspace. And the economics of cyberspace is the economics of network effects and economies of scale and scope. Size matters. In markets where you have network effects, you have tipping, which is why we have a dominant maker of office software products, Microsoft. We have a dominant search engine, Google. We have a dominant social network, Facebook. But in economies like that, you also have the ability to tip away from as well as towards. That dominance may be more fragile than you think it is, and if you don't believe that, talk to BlackBerry or talk to Yahoo. One morning, you're Yahoo. The next morning, you wake up and you're Yahoo. And it's a very different thing. It's very hard to see it coming. And once you wake up on that second morning, it's almost impossible to turn it around. We've grown up for 25 years with a first mover advantage. We all take for granted that the internet's an American thing. We don't even think about it. Everybody else in the world is intensely conscious of the fact that they live in a world defined by Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google. Okay, we just consider it the air we breathe, the natural state of things. Well, it's not a natural state of things, and it's not something to be taken for granted. So what do we do? There's a whole report full of ideas, and I'm going to spend about 3 or 4 minutes just summarizing a couple of them, maybe 5. First of all, one of the things that came out of our studies is that the private sector has to lead. Michael Hayden came up with the phrase that in the military there is the leading force and the conforming force, the leading army and the conforming army. The conforming army conforms its movements to the movements of the leading army. The private sector in this environment has to be the leading army. The government can't lead because it's not fast enough, and it's not big enough, and it's not ubiquitous enough, thank goodness. And it wouldn't be successful if it tried. But government has a key role to play, and that's the essence of this report. We wouldn't be here if we didn't think that. It needs new doctrines. It needs new doctrines. One of the things it needs to do is it needs to get very serious about understanding and promoting the success of the American internet commercial sector. Another thing it needs to do is it needs to recognize that in the internet environment, traditional doctrines of deterrence and mutual assured destruction, which we all grew up with out of the nuclear age, and this was referred to a little bit here today. Those doctrines work fine if you're talking about established nation states. They work less well if, as we all know in thinking about the terrorist threat, they work less well if you're talking about asymmetric threats from rogue actors like ISIS or North Korea. And that is very much what we are worried about today. And it's been mentioned that we looked at 4 areas: internet freedom and human rights, international trade and digital commerce, cybercrime and law enforcement, critical infrastructure and cyber defense. Everything's related to everything else. And we try to draw that out a little bit in the report, but just understand everything is related to everything else. But we looked at these 4 areas and we tried to take stock of where we stand. And it's not, as I mentioned, particularly encouraging. In fact, it's discouraging. Very briefly, online freedom as measured by Freedom House has declined 5 years running. More than half of the world's online population lives in countries that significantly constrain online freedom. And we're all, I grew up as a cyber libertarian or a cyber utopian, if you will, when I first came at this. A lot of us did. We're going to bring, freedom and enlightenment to the world, and that opportunity is still there. But the reality is that in authoritarian states like China, Iran, and Russia, the internet is now being used increasingly and successfully as a tool of control and oppression. You're going to hear Christopher Walker talk about that and others. Adaptive authoritarianism is a phrase, if you haven't Googled, you should, because the internet is as much today a technology of oppression as a technology of control, and that's a tragedy. Digital commerce is threatened by our failure to agree on and enforce international norms for intellectual property, digital trade, and data flows. We keep coming back to China, and China, I'm very respectful of China, and I think we need to approach China with a level of respect and not hostility. We also need to approach China with an understanding of a couple things. They have a different view about the relationship between individuals and the state, and there are 1.5 billion people, which is a very large ecosystem, and they're very aggressively, assertively out there seeking to capitalize on their natural advantages to advance their political beliefs, and that's perfectly fine. But it is a challenge to the United States. It's a challenge in the trade environment, and what's not perfectly fine is to engage in theft, malicious conduct, violating international trade laws, and I think at some point not okay to engage in the kind of political oppression they do. Crime and malicious conduct continues to rise. We've talked about that. The estimates are now that $2 trillion in annual costs from commercial hacking by 2019. And then lastly, America's critical infrastructure is currently vulnerable today to potentially devastating attacks by both nation-state and non-nation-state actors. And we know that nation-states have the technology to turn off the lights in this room today, right now, right? If they do not, the non-state actors, rogue states, will have that technology if we're not careful. We've already seen cyber attacks on Aramco, on Sony, in Ukraine, and Estonia, and elsewhere. So the notion of cyber war is not prospective. I'm not saying we're in a cyber war. I'm saying that attacks are occurring. We are having cyber battles occurring almost daily. Now, we have a number of recommendations, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through them in detail. I will tell you just to summarize. We believe that the United States needs to be more assertive across the board. That means more assertive in advancing our diplomatic agendas you've heard talked about. It also means more assertive when appropriate and when diplomacy and law enforcement aren't successful. It also means being more assertive in the use of cyber power. We know where malicious attacks come from in many cases. We have the capacity to raise the costs of making them or to degrade the capacity of our adversaries. We need to be more aggressive in using it. And one recommendation that I think will get some attention here today and as we go forward, and that we're going to spend a good bit of time working on as we move ahead, lastly, is that there is this tremendous gap today between the capabilities of the United States government to engage in real-time operational cyber defense and the authorities and responsibilities for that activity. To the extent any agency in the U.S. government has the authority or responsibility for protecting the critical infrastructure and civilian government agencies, that would be the Department of Homeland Security, which presides over a very complex array of committees and sub-agencies and coordinating councils and meetings and so on and so forth. What the Department of Homeland Security has been trying to do for a decade is build the capacity to actually defend an electric grid against an actual cyber attack. It hasn't been successful in doing that. I don't think there's much disagreement as we talk to people both in government and in the private sector about that fact. Right. The flip side is that there is something called the Information Assurance Directorate at the National Security Agency, which does have that capacity and is tasked today to protect national military assets, national military networks. Right? But it is not tasked, does not have the authority, absent a lot of bureaucratic finagling, to ever engage in protecting a real entity, a real network, a real ongoing concern from a real cyber attack. It has the knowledge. Often it sits and watches. Often we have a U.S. government agency with knowledge of attacks going on, but not the capacity to intervene in a timely and effective way. We think that's a problem. We think it's a big problem. We think it's a solvable problem. Some of the problems we'll talk about here today we're not going to solve. It's just a big, complex thing, and we're not going to achieve perfection. But some things are solvable, and we think that's one of them. So that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. Now, I've gone over a little bit, but I hope you excuse me for doing so. I want to now move to our first panel, and that will be chaired by Mr. Jim Glassman, former Undersecretary of State and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So, Jim, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. And I just want to say that, pardon my voice, thank you, Jeff and Mike Daniels and Mario Loyal. I've been affiliated with think tanks for 20 years, and I don't think I've ever been involved in a more important project. So I thank everybody who's been involved. So Jeff just referred to the internet as something that is not just an institution that's involved in the power to communicate, but the power to control. So I think that's a good introduction for this panel, which will be probing internet freedom and trade and governance. I just want to give you 3 paragraphs of context. So 40 or 50 years ago, when ARPANET was established just to link research institutions for the federal government, it worked very well. It essentially was a communications tool. Then in the 1990s, the internet made a critical transition. And that transition, I think, was one of the great accomplishments of government. A set of bipartisan decisions that were tremendously important. As President Clinton put it at the time, roughly 20 years ago, once a tool reserved for scientific and academic exchange, the internet has emerged as an appliance of everyday life accessible from almost any point on the planet. So President Clinton charged Ira Magaziner to come up with a set of principles to guide government involvement in the internet. And he came up with a terrific set of principles that were supported by both Democrats and Republicans. The first principle, oh, there we go. Hey, how's that? Now can you hear me? So the first principle is that in general, the internet is a medium that has tremendous potential for promoting individual freedom and individual empowerment. Therefore, where possible, the individual should be left in control of the way in which he or she uses this medium. We should maximize the opportunity for human freedom. That was the foundation of the internet in the mid-1990s. Second, Magaziner said, in establishing the rules, we have to deal with potential side effects. So he wrote, the principle that guides us here is that where possible, the rules should be set by private, nonprofit, stakeholder-based groups. And then President Clinton, in laying out his framework for global internet electronic commerce, said that the private sector should lead, government should avoid undue restrictions on electronic commerce. Where governmental involvement is needed, its aim should be to support and enforce a predictable, minimalist, consistent, and simple legal environment for commerce. This actually would be a good principle for the rest of what government does as well. But it certainly has worked extremely well over the last 20 years. Now, we have challenges, partly from our own government, but certainly from the outside. And we're going to hear about that right now. I just want to introduce you to the panel very, very briefly, and they will speak in this order. Chris Walker is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, co-author, co-editor of a terrific new book, Authoritarianism Goes Global. Jeff referred to the idea of adaptive authoritarianism, which I hope Chris will talk about. Claude Barfield is a resident scholar at AEI, where he specializes in trade. He's the author of several books, including Free Trade, Sovereignty, Democracy, the Future of the World Trade Organization. Gary Shapiro is president and CEO of the Consumer Technology Association, a trade association that represents 2,200 consumer technology companies. And Scott Carpenter is managing director at Jigsaw, formerly Google Ideas. Before that, he and I were colleagues at the State Department, where he was a deputy assistant secretary in the Bureau of Near East Affairs. So we'll start with Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to start off by commending the authors of this report, which is extremely timely. It's a very thoughtful report, and it's really a pleasure to be here to have an opportunity to talk about a part of it. I'm going to focus on the internet freedom and human rights dimension of this issue. And I'd note right at the outset that Jeff Eisenach made the point in his opening remarks that cyber is what we make it. I think what I would say at the outset is, who is the we? Because part of the challenge we confront today is that there's been a profound shift in the global landscape in terms of how global politics are evolving, the overall threats to democracy and democratic norms. This is a central part of the book that we've put out recently that Jim alluded to. And I think it's important to recognize that the integrity and the flourishing of cyberspace can't happen independently from these larger issues of the direction the globe is going. So that would be the first point I would make. So what does this mean? If I were to give examples of a number of countries, if we were sitting here 20 years ago and thinking about the direction of global media and the internet at the time, essentially a nascent thing, we would have thought the future looks pretty rosy by and large for a whole host of reasons. And I'll give the short version of this kind of 20 years of history. I think what people underestimated was how rapidly and how comprehensively illiberal powers that don't put freedom first and foremost have reorganized themselves, and as Jeff and other speakers alluded to, have managed to take the steps to retool cyber for their own purposes. So if we look at the non-cyber world, authoritarian regimes, and it's a very long list. China's been mentioned a number of times, but we're talking about China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and a host of other countries which have been authoritarian regimes for quite some time, but in the Freedom House assessments, they've become even more intensely repressive over the last decade. And I think this is one way of understanding how the overall landscape has changed. So authoritarian governments have become bolder and more effective at preventing dissent before it begins. Repressive government have developed more effective ways of using the superficial forms of law as a way to repress their own populations. And they've developed new techniques for manipulating media both online and off. And I'd stress this. So we're talking about cyber here, but it's interesting to see the ways in which traditional media have also been arrogated in recent years by illiberal regimes for their own purposes. And I mention this because one of the theses of the book is that over these years, as these regimes have adapted, they've incubated methods of repression domestically and are now applying them beyond their borders in various ways. And I don't want to suggest that the Chinas, the Russias, and the Irans of the world can take precisely what they're doing domestically and simply translate that into effectiveness overseas. I think the way to see this is more in terms of adapting to what's possible beyond their borders. So, for example, domestically in Russia, China, Iran, all of the instruments of the state are at the disposal of powers that really have unchecked authority. For all practical purposes, when it comes to political speech, political competition, these are regimes that have virtually no checks on their power domestically, and therefore they can impose censorship without many limitations. They can impose their propaganda domestically with any real checks. There isn't media pluralism to contest this. There isn't civil society to question and check this sort of behavior. And so this is a very different environment, but I think what we see is the use of disinformation, trolls, cyber attacks. Russia has troll factories that have been written about by investigative journalists, both to some degree within Russia, where possible, extremely courageous journalists within Russia writing about the troll factory that's gotten so much attention in St. Petersburg. But it's been discussed more widely beyond Russia's borders. This is essentially a troll operation operating on an industrial scale, 24/7, apparently hundreds of employees, pumping out pollution of cyberspace, both within the Russophone cyber environment, but also beyond Russia's borders. China, as was reported the week before last in a Harvard University study, is putting out 488 million fake posts. The real insight of this report by Harvard, which I would commend to everyone, was not the fact that the 50-cent party exists. This has been knowledge for quite some time. The insight of this report was the percentage of the 50-cent army warriors within China who are government bureaucrats, who are working in government offices, and the estimate was it's well over 90%. So these aren't ordinary people that have just decided to do this to make a little money on the side. This is the illiberal version of a whole-of-government approach to polluting cyberspace. And I think this is a very important point when we think about the challenges that have emerged from a host of countries that have a very different set of preferences when it comes to how cyberspace should evolve. And so just two concluding points. The issue of norms has come up properly so in just about every part of the discussion so far. And I think one of the things to keep in mind in the norms context, and this is an insight that Ron Diebert has made, who's just a fantastic scholar, both in terms of the technical dimensions of cyberspace, but also the policy dimensions. Really a very impressive analyst and scholar who's contributed a chapter to our book called Cyberspace Under Siege. He makes the observation that increasingly the illiberal, closed regional bodies that many people didn't take so seriously, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, are now used as fora for reshaping a whole host of norms, online and off. But I think the online norms are the dimension that needs to have more attention paid. We often look at the global level, which requires attention, but the challenges to Internet norms are happening on a wide range of levels, some of them escaping what I would say is sufficient attention. So let me conclude with just a brief thought. I think in some ways, and in increasing ways, authoritarian regimes have turned the openness of the online space to their advantage. And it's essential, I think, that the democracies reckon with the reality of the new normal of cyberspace if we're all going to safeguard the integrity of the online space. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Just really quickly, one of our recommendations is use all elements of U.S. diplomatic and economic policy to discourage autocratic states from censorship and oppression. And within that, there's the recommendation that to sort of focus on this issue, to have the Department of State publish an annual report that brings together all the sections of the existing country reports on freedom, to focus on the online freedom. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I think there are a number of initiatives that are already doing a very good job. The Freedom House Freedom on the Net report is an outstanding and thoughtful report. I see no reason not to marshal whatever resources are available to have a more systematic spotlight shown on this issue.
Thank you. And another one of those recommendations is the U.S. should consider filing actions in the WTO against repressive governments such as China, whose censorship of global information services appears to violate the General Agreement on Trade and Services. And I think that that is one of the things that Claude Barfield will talk about.
Thank you, Jim. It is one of the things I will talk about. I want to make points in two areas. One, what I consider the baseline rules and new obligations and mandates on cyber trade in the new or the projected Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and I'll come back to that. And second, that what Jim referred to is, and this is more on a, you might say, the frontiers of policy, because we don't know where that would end, at least explore the possibility of tying the censorship regime in China, and it could go to other countries too, back to WTO rules. This is a difficult, I think, process, but it would be worth exploring. But let me go back first to the TPP. I know that up here on Capitol Hill, the TPP is quite a controversial negotiation, and it's gone through and still is going through the pearls of Pauline. There are some who don't like trade agreements in general. There are others up here on both the Democrat and Republican sides that think that there's this or that part of the TPP that does not measure up to what they had expected. But I think there's one thing that is true, and I think this would be bipartisan, and certainly would be true with the two senators who are here today, and that is that the provisions in the TPP that relate to cyber trade are an unalloyed triumph for the United States. And the key here is that this will set the baseline, I think, or potentially the baseline for other trade agreements. Let me just be quickly specific about what's in there. There is a provision that the nations of the TPP, the 12 countries, must provide for the free data flow and data transfer as a condition of doing business. They cannot wipe that out for somebody as a condition of doing business in their country. It must also live up to obligations that there's no forced localization. You don't have to have your servers or other equipment in a particular country to do business in that country. There's a provision that there will be no customs duties on their flow of data. There are also provisions that for consumer protection and for privacy. And the point of the whole thing is, and there are other specifics here I'm not going to go into in this short period, though I'd be happy to answer questions. The whole thing is wrapped up as a part of the dispute settlement system that is a part of the TPP. So that if you have a grievance against another country in the TPP related to cyber trade, there are provisions for you to take that to a dispute settlement body that will then make a decision as to whether you're correct or not. The point of this is the following. And here's why it's timing that is really important. In terms of international law, whether it's trade law or broader international law, we are still at the beginning of moving toward a set of, we've talked this morning about a set of norms or a set of actual principles that nations will abide by. If the TPP succeeds, it will become the most important baseline, and certainly in the trade community. The TPP itself covers about 40% of world GDP and about just under a third of world trade. There are other nations beyond the 12, of South Korea, Indonesia, Colombia, other nations that say that they want to get into the TPP if it succeeds, so that it will really be an important baseline. It will also be an important baseline for other negotiations that are ongoing right now or in the future. One, there's a trade and services negotiation of the WTO that is going on. Secondly, we are in the midst of negotiations with Europe for a U.S.-European trade and investment agreement, the so-called TTIP. And then finally, down the road, I know it is hard to imagine this maybe right now, but down the road, there will be a new round of trade negotiations in the WTO. And so you will have the possibility, should things work out, that you actually get something like the TPP in the trade and services, and some part of the TPP in terms of cyber data flow rules in the TTIP. That this will be building toward, I think, a set of rules that are worldwide rules that will stem from this, I think, baseline agreement. So I think it is quite important. I can understand the disagreements up here. But one of the things that Congress ought to take into account is what we will lose if we walk away from it in terms of the 20th century. There's a lot of hype, I know, that the TPP is a 21st century agreement. And we could argue back and forth about that. But certainly I think there would be no doubt that the data flow and the cyber issue, e-commerce sections of the TPP are the quintessential part of any kind of trade agreement that is called the 21st century agreement. Now, let me briefly just talk a little bit about the whole question of China and censorship. Obviously, WTO and the WTO. WTO rules, the last negotiations of the WTO ended in 1995. The internet was something at least a decade in the future in terms of its reality, in terms of its use, in terms of actual commerce. And so there are no rules that really are directly related to e-commerce in the WTO. And I am someone who is very cautious about suggesting that rules that were made for other things are stretched in the WTO, because the WTO can be very careful about questions of democratic legitimacy. On the other hand, there are areas, I think, that were negotiated in the 1990s with the Uruguay round that do have implications. Do have implications for China's Great Firewall, its sweeping censorship regime. And they are the following. The Chinese, in their services agreement, agreed that new rules and regulations, and this included the new technologies, which would include the internet, you would have a set of due process rules that you'd go through. If you were going to change something, if you wanted to cut off, whether it was a product or a service or data, you would give notice and comment. You would have provisions for appeal against the decision. In many of China's actions over the last decade, that has just been swept aside. The Chinese just have announced arbitrarily that something was going to happen, or there would be some forbidding of a particular data flow or a particular the provisions of a particular company in China. And so I think that is one area. The other area is the following. There is when you take actions that are protectionist actions, which normally would go against WTO or trade rules, all nations or all WTO rules provide for public morals exceptions or national security exceptions. And the Chinese have invoked this in explaining some of their actions, and particularly a lot of their actions in relation to censorship. And it is true that you can, I think, that is something the United States uses, other nations use. But the key question here is the sweeping nature of Chinese censorship. And in cases that do not directly deal with this, the WTO legal apparatus has made it clear that just because you disagree with one part of something, and you have the Chinese might not like to have a movie or a book, does not mean that you could then sweep out all books and movies that are being presented by a particular company. And specifically here, I would say the Chinese action that wiped out the Apple book and movie division would seem to be ripe for at least testing. So that I think in the future, what we argue in the report, in the future, the administration, this administration and next administration really ought to test this to see what a panel in the WTO or the appellate body would say when you get a situation where the Chinese have just sort of swept a whole provision or a whole division in terms of a business organization out, invoking censorship and invoking public morals. We don't know where it would come out, but it's worth testing. Thank you.
Claude, just to put this into context, how important is digital trade?
Well, I don't have the numbers are in here. I don't have them on top of my head here, but it's just increasingly, it's not so much just the information itself; it's the way businesses do business. And the key, you might think this is hype because everybody says, "Oh God, this is great for," particularly up here. Defending anything, you've got to say it's for small and medium-sized businesses, and a lot of that is hype. But in terms of the internet, and in terms of the business future, that is really true because it allows small and medium-sized businesses who do not have either the money or the capability to actually physically go to other countries to get there very quickly. And we're seeing that that's really where you have a great deal of increase in terms of business activity, not just in the United States, but in other small businesses and in other countries back here.
And you see the TPP provisions on digital trade as the model going forward?
Yes, obviously we're not going to get everything we got in TPP with the TTIP or with the Europeans who have major questions. We may not get everything in the TISA, or the Trade and Services Agreement, but you do have a baseline that if this comes into fruition, is something that everyone will look to as a starting point, and that is key, I think.
I have to say, I don't think we've had a very sophisticated discussion of TPP by the presidential candidates. It might be interesting to hear them talk about the digital part of it. You know, what are their views?
I'd rather not hear their views on that. It's bad enough on the other stuff.
Gary.
Thank you. I had the Consumer Technology Association. We're 2,400 U.S. technology companies, and we own and produce a CES in Las Vegas every January, the world's largest innovation event. And we are focused laser-like on innovation and why it is, in fact, a national strategy and why it could be a better national strategy. Jeff mentioned that for 25 years we've had the first mover advantage with the internet, and there's no question we do. We have. If you look at, there's great companies that Jeff mentioned, but there's a ton of others that are in vertical categories that dominate the world, and the world is copied. And you could even go out a little bit and talk about Uber, or you could talk about Airbnb, or Etsy, or eBay, or E-Trade, or so many other companies. And it's all because of the internet. And they're U.S. companies for the most part, and it's tough to come up with original internet companies from other countries. Now, China has actually, because of its wall, has created a couple that have done some interesting things that we haven't done, like WeChat, and as well as Baidu and others that are almost a form of currency there now. But we have done well because of our focus on innovation. And I've written a couple of books on innovation, best-selling books, and several hundred articles, and I've traveled the world, and I hear every government in the world wants to be like the U.S. and do what we're doing and have our entrepreneurial spirit and nature. In fact, in China, the last 5-year plan had a goal of innovation. It defined innovation by the number of patents and a percentage increase, and it resulted in a lot of relatively weak patents. But they're getting more strategic. They've realized that there's something special in our sauce here. And so they've sent a lot of kids to school here. China has more kids in school than every other nation, other than the U.S., in school in the U.S. now, at younger and younger ages, because they think it's how we raise our kids, which is partially true. But I believe it's also our culture, our immigrant nation, our diversity, our First Amendment, our encouragement of risk and entrepreneurship, our reward for that. It's our ability to fail and be succeeded. And it's the fact that we have a free and open internet which has made such a difference. And I've been to China twice in the last few years. Last 3 months I've been to China twice. I've been there several times in the last few years. China, I was on the treadmill in a hotel a few months ago when the Panama story was breaking, and watching CNN and going back between networks. And they're all doing stories. Every time a story came on about Panama, my screen went blank for 5 minutes. And but one of the great frustrations now for U.S. travelers to China is it's not the infrastructure of the internet. It's great in big cities if you're going to Chinese websites. If you try to get to a U.S. website, it is very slow to impossible, especially a media website. It's a great frustration. You talk about journalists. Every journalist in China essentially works for the government, and those rules have gotten tighter and tighter. So in some ways, they're going the wrong direction, and when it comes to cybersecurity, obviously that's a reason for concern. What we have done is, just as a strategy ourselves, as an association for representing the technology industry, we've gone out and ranked every state in the United States by how friendly they are to innovation. What policies do they have? Do they encourage startups? Do they have great broadband speeds? Are they friendly to those groups that challenge the status quo, those companies like Uber or Lyft or Airbnb? And we rank them all. It's very objective. Some of it's a little subjective on various criteria. And the results have been fairly predictable what you expect. California loses some points because they don't have a flexible workforce. They have a lot of rules on companies, but they have a lot of good things as well. And some states do very well. Well, we want to take the same thing we're going to be announcing shortly. We're going to be doing it with countries. And one of the criteria for countries is going to be how open and free their internet is. Because without an open and free internet, it's very, very difficult to be a startup, to try to challenge the status quo, to get information from around the world which could help your business. And what I'm seeing in China is, and one of the reasons that real estate prices here are going up a lot of Chinese are investing a lot of money in U.S. real estate. And the reason they're doing that is because They value the freedom we have here. They value our entrepreneurial system. They value the fact that if you're the best and the brightest, you want to come here and do business here and study here. And that's something I think we have to keep and maintain as a country. That's something we should be pushing. And that's part of our internet freedom, if you will. Of course, as you just noted, I think no country is totally free in terms of our internet. We don't allow child pornography. We don't allow bestiality. We don't allow certain types of gambling. We don't allow extortion rackets. We don't allow a lot of things on our internet. Every country can and should have its own restrictions. But when it comes to a total way of doing business and changing and limiting and restricting how people get things, that's a problem. And also, that, though, is a country's right to do. We may not like it, but that's their right. But when it comes to the crime of cybersecurity, we are stepping in the right direction, and that's why I applaud what the senators did this morning with their announcement. I think I'm proud to be affiliated with this report that's here. It goes totally in the right direction. How can we have all these great policies on air and water and everything else and have nothing on cybersecurity? No cabinet level position, no great attention focused on it. And every day, all of us are subject to literally thousands of attempts to break down our computer systems, and we're seeing that. So I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate what Jeff and Mike Daniels, one of the great legends. Look, your company that you started, that you bought for $3 million and sold for $21 billion eventually, was really launched the internet, got it going. I know it was just naming domain names in a sense, but it really was something which has been been here and done well since you found it and discovered it, nurtured it, and brought it to another company and continued along. And I appreciate the fact you're willing to donate your time and give to make sure that the USA is strong with a free, strong internet strategy. I'm done.
I got it. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. So I feel like an airplane pilot in the middle of the flight announcing the results of the Super Bowl. But as I'm sure at least half the people in this room know, the Court of Appeals in Washington just ruled in favor of the SEC in the so-called net neutrality case, which has a little bit of bearing on what we're talking about today, although we may or may not get into that. Okay, I'm going to turn to Scott Carpenter of Google.
Without leaving.
Yeah, I didn't even hear that. So I guess we will come to that later. First of all, I want to thank Mike and AEI and the authors and the organizers of the working group that took a look at this, Jeff, for the remarkable work that's gone into it, for the opportunity to participate. I think it's an excellent report, and I can't help but notice that there's a little bright light over here, and it looks like it's on top of AEI's building. I'm not exactly sure, but I think longitude, latitude, it will turn out that way. The new building. So first, a quick note about Jigsaw, just because I want to take the opportunity to introduce people to it. Jigsaw, once Google Ideas, is a research and tech incubator at Google. We look at ways to leverage technology to address a certain number of what we consider very important challenges related to responding to online repressive censorship, responding to various forms of online harassment that are related to censorship, and also looking at extremism online. So it's really in that context that I come to speak to you. Jigsaw is not a policy shop. We really want to think about what the technology allows. We talk to a lot of people as a result. To start us off, I just want to have a show of hands of how many people in this room on a daily basis use a VPN across their entire device on a daily basis. Okay. What's interesting about that is most of us don't use VPNs on our devices, and that's because we have access to what is essentially, and with some restrictions, a free and open internet. And Chris did an excellent job of kind of painting the picture of the authoritarian challenge. But one of the things I just want to have us think a little bit about as we dig into this is that which is the country in the world that has the highest level use of VPNs per capita in the world? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia. So one of the issues is that people are pretty smart, and when they're being censored, they want to find other ways to access a freer, more open internet, and technology is also helping them do that. It is a cat and mouse game, to be sure, and when governments enact policies that are ambiguous, it's sometimes even worse. Like, I think Kazakhstan has a law which says that if you use any type of encryption, you are in violation of the law. Well, HTTPS is encryption. So that ambiguity causes a lot of challenges. But VPNs are flourishing. Strategies like, what's the word I'm looking for? Domain fronting is another technology that is spreading around the world to help people access the internet. Proxies of all sorts on the cloud, et cetera, are there. There are findings about that in the report itself. But there is this broader challenge, and I want to focus on 3 recommendations in the report, just very briefly, to dig into them a little bit. One is this notion that as the internet expands, there's a strong correlation between that expansion and people's desire for internet freedom. That has a corollary in, therefore, what we should be doing in terms of emphasizing in our development places, USAID, the World Bank, and others, to build out this infrastructure more quickly in places where it has not yet come, so that there can be demand for internet freedom as the internet expands, so that it is not being used as a tool of oppression, but a tool for enlightenment and communications and empowering people. That recommendation is included in the report and goes a little bit deeper. The other recommendation that's made is that the U.S. government needs to do more to strengthen civil society that is operating in this space, supporting the research that Chris and others are doing at the National Endowment, but also thinking more broadly about how do you create opportunities for the most vulnerable users, human rights activists, political activists, investigative journalists from around the world to access the technology that they need to protect themselves. There's a great example of this. It's called the ISC project. It is funded, I think, by OTI at USAID. It was almost killed last year, which would have been a real shame because it does precisely this. It brings all of the different players together who are working in the circumvention world, looking to protect the most vulnerable users, pair them up with activists from around the world who are in peril and have created a community to address a lot of these problems. We need to do more of that. But the most important aspect and element of all of this really does relate to internet governance. And as has been noted, authoritarians are adapting. They're adapting by understanding kind of what's at stake in many of these bodies, but they're also creating alternative bodies to compete more directly with institutions like ICANN, IANA, the Internet Governance Forum, et cetera, which requires a response. We need to invest more heavily in these multi-stakeholder fora. Those multi-stakeholder fora are the places where the internet was born. These were the places where the internet has thrived and grown exponentially, and we need to find ways of protecting that mode of operation. The IGF has been, their mandate has been extended for the next 10 years, which is a great thing, but I think that over those next 10 years, we really have to continue to pay attention to it, to fund active participation in it, and to make sure that it becomes an institution going forward for this opportunity to bring lots of different discussions into about the future of the internet. But the citadel, if you will, the place where I think as an example of where we really have to pay attention is at the technical standards level of the internet, and making sure that the the rough consensus process that is used at the IETF, for instance, is maintained. And just recently, there have been a number of things that the IETF has done that goes to this point of protecting the open online aspects of the internet. Just to give you a quick example, the domain .onion is associated with Tor, and I don't know how many of you know the Tor project, but anyway, it's a very important tool for many human rights activists. It's also an important tool for some bad actors as well. But the point is, for .onion, they were having a hard time getting top domain level support. In the IETF, they just did it. And they said that this is going to be a top-level domain. And the importance of that, it allows for hidden services to continue to get SSL certificates so that they can serve people who are trying to get to Facebook from places that they couldn't get to, or get to Google or Twitter or whatever, so that they can actually continue to access those places. I mentioned domain fronting as a way for people to be able to access a freer, more open internet. The IETF is also working on standards like TLS 1.3, which will make that strategy ubiquitous, which will, again, be really, really important for all of us who are deeply concerned about the ability to continue to access a free and more open internet from anywhere in the world. I'll stop there, but say that these bodies have really served us well, and we need to be very, very careful about how we change them, and because the future of the internet really is at stake in these international bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for raising the governance issue. And you know, there's a lot of talk about ICANN and IANA these days, but however that's resolved, it's not going to end the challenge that currently exists. You talk about a rough consensus process. The multi-stakeholder model has worked extremely well, but we can't be complacent about it. And one of our recommendations is vigorously promote and defend the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And I think vigorously is the right word. We don't have very much time, right, Jeff? We'll take some questions from the floor. Did you want to just comment very briefly on something Gary said?
Well, just one comment on the norms issue. I think here, too, it's important not to separate the cyber-related bodies from what's happening at a larger level, because conceptually, I think it's fair to say that the multi-stakeholder idea, the idea of a pluralistic approach to making decisions, has been a target of illiberal forces across a whole host of bodies. So if you look, just to give one example, at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and its Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights deals with democracy-related issues, media freedom, election observation. It's been one of the focal points for illiberal governments who essentially tried to take just putting it bluntly, the pluralism out of that in the name of a kind of an absolutist interpretation of sovereignty. And these are the arguments that are being made, which are absolutely being applied now in the cyber realm. So I think understanding this in a larger sense is critical, because it's not going to change. I mean, this is the Saudis and the Iranians agree on very little. They're rivals, but they agree on this. And they align their views in the cyber governance realm along with China and Russia. And this is something where I think it was Senator Warner said, much more collaboration among the democracies is required over time to meet the sort of alignment that's happened, certainly on these cyber governance issues, from the non-democracies.
And I think the real threat is we have these authoritarian countries, and within their countries there are restrictions which we certainly don't like. But now they're beginning to bleed over, and in some cases they're not authoritarian countries. I think everyone should read page 34, maybe not right now, about the right to be forgotten case, which is tremendously important. Okay, questions? Yes, sir, in the back. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, good morning. Philip Corwin, and the question is for the gentleman to your immediate, right next to you. He talked
Chris
about
Walker.
the troll. Mr. Walker, yes. A few weeks ago, the New York Times had a front page story about a Finnish journalist who started investigating Russian trolls and in turn was viciously attacked and harassed and slandered by them. And I'm going to Helsinki in a week for the next ICANN meeting, and a member of the ICANN community from Finland has set up a meeting for some of us with this journalist. Besides letting her know that people care about what's going on and give her moral support, is there anything more concrete we can do to support people who are investigating state-operated repression and to work against that type of censorship activity on the internet?
So you're absolutely right. The name of that journalist was Jessica Arno, and she works for the Finnish national broadcaster. And interestingly enough, the attacks from the trolls, which by all accounts seem to be emanating from the Russian space, was based on a story that she did on the troll factory in St. Petersburg, Russia. And these were, as you noted, these were vicious attacks. I think part of this is raising awareness at the elite level and the mass level for how systematically this is happening. This is one example, but you don't need to talk to many journalists working on these sorts of issues in and around Russia or dissidents within or without China who are subjected to smear campaigns that are, by all accounts, coordinated, that require some sort of higher level coordination to pull them off. This is a much wider phenomenon in this case. I'm very glad it got a lot of attention, but I think the first step is to do the sorts of things that are happening. In the absence of a clear recognition of a systematic problem, you're not going to get the policy outcomes that are desired, I don't think.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on to the next panel. Thank you all, panelists.
Nice job.
Thank you, same.
Doing your stuff.
Oh, okay. This is Shane Choose, who will introduce herself.
Fantastic. Love to be.
Just having a quick change out of panels. We're now serving brunch in the back of the room. Okay, thanks. Well, it was breakfast to start, but thank you all for being here this morning. We're really excited to have you be part of the launch of the American Strategy for Cyberspace. This panel discussion is on crime and security, and I'm being joined by Bob Dix from Juniper Networks, Richard Balich from FireEye, and Rich Andres from the National War College. For me, this is kind of like that party. If somebody says, you're having a dinner party, who would you want to invite? It's like, if I get to sit down and talk about cyber, these are three of my favorite people. So I'm really excited to have this discussion, and I look forward to talking to them. I realize we're running a little short on time. I think we get to go till about 11:30, so we'll try to take a few, 11:45. So we can, we're gonna have a little dialogue and then take some questions from you all. So if you don't mind just making a couple quick comments yourselves on what's going on and the report and anything of interest. Well, I'm sorry. For Bob, I'm going to cut that back to the report.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking time to be here with us today and engage in this very, very important dialogue. And I, too, would like to share with other colleagues and thank and congratulate AEI and the authors of this report for bringing it to where we are today. This discussion will be just a little bit different than the previous panel and the focus on security and cybercrime and critical infrastructure protection. And for me, I'm just going to tee up a couple of items here that perhaps can provoke some additional dialogue and discussion should time permit. Over time, there's been a lot of conversation, and like many of the people in this room, I've had the opportunity to be involved in this discussion for a long period of time, including, just as a note, that during the 108th Congress, when a piece of legislation known as FISMA was passed, I was the staff director for the House Subcommittee on Technology and Information Policy with responsibility for oversight of the implementation of that particular law. And why I mention that is listening to Senators Warner and Gardner this morning talk about the fact that today, 2016, we still have an issue with knowing what we have running in our environments at a time 14 years after a law was passed that required federal departments and agencies to know just that piece of information. So at any rate, not spending a lot of time looking in the rearview mirror, but with the idea of how do we provide advice to the next administration, let me tee up a couple of items that I feel are low-hanging fruit. Data suggests that roughly 80% of exploitable vulnerabilities in cyberspace are a direct result of poor or no cyber hygiene. Basic fundamental measures that users of all levels of sophistication can implement in their environments to raise their bar of protection. How do we address that? So it's interesting that shortly after this president came into office, he commissioned what was known as a cyberspace policy review. And in May of 2009, issued a report that included a number of near-term action items and longer-term action items. Item number 6 in the near-term items was to create and implement a national education and awareness campaign around cybersecurity. It's time for us to do that. It's time for us to help teach users what are those low-cost, no-cost measures that they can implement in their environments to raise the bar of protection and address that 80% issue while we're still dealing with the additional 20% of more sophisticated problems. That makes the job more difficult for the bad guys and more costly for the bad guys and gets to the issue of cyber economics that Jeff talked about earlier today. Secondly, having an operational capability that allows us to have early detection and improve in our risk management activities that is an essential component of our national and economic security. And what I mean by that is today we spend a lot of time in response and recovery. We've got to flip that equation to where we get better at detection, prevention, and mitigation by being able to, through information sharing, analysis, and collaboration, being able to identify patterns and trends of abnormal, unusual, or even malicious behavior, to be able to issue alerts and warnings and recommended protective measures across a wide range of stakeholders. We can learn from the models at the Centers for Disease Control, where in that disease community, we're able to put out alerts and warnings in communities around issues they should be concerned about. The National Weather Service has, through data analytics and technology, been able to be more predictive about weather events that could create damage or worse, and be able to issue alerts and warnings. We should be able to do the same thing in the cyber domain and improve our ability to manage that risk. Lastly, for now, is the fact that as we sit here today in 2016, we have no plan in this country of how we will react in industry or government in the event of a cyber event of national consequence. We do not have an approved national cyber incident response plan that identifies roles and responsibilities at various thresholds of escalation for a cyber event that may have national or global consequence. We've got to do a better job of being able to have that understanding. And when we get to the conversation about the trust between industry and government, that would be a huge step towards moving forward, that we have a predictable and sustainable approach to how we are going to work together in the event that we are under siege in that manner. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Bob. So I guess you're saying I should not use ... as my password. Richard Balich.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Baitlick from FireEye, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning. I enjoyed being part of the development of the report, and I just want to share a few thoughts, much in the spirit of my colleague here. The first one is that I think we need to change the way we think about security, especially in the federal government. There's been some effort to do this in the private sector, where I spend most of my time, but we haven't seen the same evolution in the public sector. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. When OPM was hacked, the question became, well, what was the fallout? Who was affected? How do we clean up? And so forth. I don't think I heard anyone ask, who else is inside OPM's network? Who was there before? Who will be there next week? The focus was all on, oh, this bad thing happened, we have to clean up. No one thinks, and this is what you mentioned, it's 2016 and we still don't have a national cyber incident response plan. It's 2016 and people still don't think about the intruders that are already inside our organizations. They, especially in the federal government, the idea is we're getting ready for the big one. The big one's out there and we just need to keep doing whatever it is we're doing and maybe one day we'll be ready. Well, the point of fact is you will never be ready. There is nothing anyone can do to stop a determined adversary. I'm talking about the NSA. You know, NSA had the biggest breach in history, perhaps. So we have to get past this idea that as long as we keep building walls, we'll keep intruders out. We have to shift from a strategy of, now, in all due respect, I'm not saying that we should try to just give up on prevention. We have to stop as much as we can. But we have to live in a world that says bad things will happen. And when they do happen, we need to identify it quickly and do something about it. Now, some good news around that is we have made progress in this respect. The statistics that my company keeps shows that over the last 5 years or so, we've reduced the amount of dwell time. In other words, the amount of time between when an intruder gets into your enterprise and when you find them. We've reduced that from 400 days or plus, like 465 days, which is well over a year, down to about 146 days. So percentage-wise, that's great. If you step back and you say, well, 146 days, we're talking months here. So this is clearly not acceptable. We need to get this down from years, months, weeks, days, preferably hours. When I ran the incident response team at General Electric, we had marching orders that we had to do that process in 1 hour. So within 1 hour, we had to find anybody who had broken into the company and decide what to do about it. So we need to get that mindset into the federal space as well. Secondly, we need to have a mindset not only in the private sector, but also in the public sector of a piece I wrote for Brookings called If You Can't Protect It, Don't Collect It. What we're doing is we are all data hoarders. Individually, we're data hoarders, but organizationally, we are data hoarders. And the problem with hoarding data is that it becomes a target that someone can steal, disrupt, profit from, etc. I know of a few organizations who have recognized that this data is essentially a liability, and they're taking steps to reduce that liability. So, for example, this one holding company I know of, this conglomerate, said, is it possible for us to eliminate Social Security numbers in our organization? Do we need them for our employees? Do we need them for our customers? Do we need them for business partners and so forth? It turns out they were able to get rid of every Social Security number in their company with one exception, and that was a unit that dealt in student loans. Now think about it. If you don't have to protect Social Security numbers, they can't be stolen, they can't be used for identity theft, and so on. Now, you may be thinking Social Security numbers is kind of a... at this point, everyone's Social Security number is published somewhere in the underground, whether criminal or in probably the Chinese archive somewhere. But we need to get past this idea of just collecting data. It's great, it's free, it's wonderful. It turns out it creates a giant liability, and the burden of that is mostly borne by the victims of identity theft, not the organizations who are storing this data. And then finally, you've probably heard about the rise of something called ransomware. This is making the news. This is where someone breaks into your company, they encrypt your data, and then they extort you to give you keys to decrypt your data. We've seen a little bit of this activity against places we care about, hospitals, police departments, and so forth. What happens when this happens to the federal government? What if someone breaks into some database that we care about, perhaps operated by the IRS, someone else, and encrypts all that data and holds the U.S. government ransom in order to decrypt it? How embarrassing would that be? Well, how disruptive would that be? It's just the latest in the evolution of attacks that we're dealing with. We started out with low-end stuff, simply denial of service attacks, making it difficult to access data. Now we've gone through this giant phase of espionage where people break into your network to steal your data. We're at the apex of it now where people are encrypting your data, making it not available to you. And the final thing that'll eventually arrive will be they'll be changing the data subtly in ways that they can profit from, but that we won't recognize until it's too late. So I know that's really fun and not at all gloomy, but I do believe that this report is a step in the right direction towards addressing many of these problems. Thank you.
Every time I hear Richard speak, I just want to start deleting things. Rich.
My name is Richard Andrus, and I'm there we go. I don't know how to use a microphone, but I'm doing a cyber talk, which is, of course.
Quietly.
Rich Andrus, I'm a professor at the National War College, and I have to caveat this by saying what I'm saying today. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not representing the Department of Defense in any of my comments. So I guess if I had to just make a couple of quick points today, I would start with this one. Whenever we come from the Department of Defense or any of the government organizations to start talking about threats, inevitably there's a large part of the audience which sort of groans and they hit their head and they say, oh no, overblown. This is the fear mongers talking again. So this is the background whenever I come and talk in forums like this. So I want to recognize that. But there's another side. We've had the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense. We've had the Director of NSA, two directors of NSA come and say this is very serious, one of the most serious threats the nation is facing. And behind that, there's some reasons why the government looks at this differently from the private sector. And I want to talk about that just a moment, the difference in perspective. And part of that is that the capability of threat and the willingness tends to be well ahead of the public understanding. So about a year before the Iranians took down Aramco, I did a tour of Aramco's systems, and I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe how insecure their systems were. And I went and I made a big stink about it. And they said, listen, we don't worry about that. That's not a problem. You're overblowing the threat. That was about a year before they took down Aramco. I can't say that I went to Iran and talked to them about Stuxnet, but I will say that about 2 weeks after or before the Stuxnet became public in the press, I had just run the second large whole-of-government private public symposium looking at infrastructure protection against threats like Stuxnet here in the United States to try to bring our CEOs, our companies together with government to think about the potential threat. A lot of times, public is well behind the government in understanding what the nature of the threat is and who the threat actors are out there. And so when the Director of National Intelligence comes out to the Senate, as he does every year, and says, look, the top of my list for threats is cyber, right? There's a reason he's doing that. So I want to start with that. Well, why is that? Why is it that the government sees this thing a little bit different? Well, one of the reasons is whether it's a government, whether it's another country attacking or whether it's a private organization attacking or a non-governmental agency attacking, people keep this stuff private. Attackers never announce what they're doing, and defenders do backflips try not to let the public know or other people know they've been attacked. So consequently, what you hear in the news is usually years behind what's really going on. There's a reason for that. People try to keep this stuff secret. It confuses the public, but that's what's going on. And it comes out a couple of years later, and then people say, oh yeah, well, you were right 2 years ago, but now you're overblowing the threat. The second thing is there's interest at stake, right? When you talk about the potential problems in cyberspace, it's like a Rubik's Cube. And if you get the defense side perfect, you're going to restrict civil liberties and rights in the country. And if you got defense and civil liberties rights, you're going to hurt business, right? You have to get all of these facets of the cube right at the same time, and it's impossible. It's very, very difficult. So you always have some parts of society which are fighting very hard against this defense side that tends to take up my attention to a large extent. And the third thing is, right now in government, we don't have one organization that's responsible for cybersecurity of the civilian sector. Right? It's owned by lots and lots of different organizations, and what's owned by everyone is owned by no one. And so you've got a big problem here with the dispersion of responsibility across a wide number of organizations. Until we get that fixed or at least improved, we're going to continue to have this problem. So from the defense side, what are we looking at right now? The United States is the most secure country in the world. We've built this incredible moat. We have oceans around us. We have navies. We have air forces. We have ground forces. But we've built this giant moat, and then we put in a very, very wide bridge called cyberspace directly into the heart of the castle. And that door is wide open. And until we figure out how to secure that door, our companies aren't safe, our private organizations aren't safe, even organizations in the government like OPM are not safe. We've got to figure out how to fix this problem. So that's the situation as I see it. How does this fight take place? What does it look like, right? It's not jet airplanes soaring overhead. It's not troops marching. Cyberspace has a different logic. When you're fighting country versus country, the logic is to be as sneaky as you possibly can. And what you attempt to do is, what happens in war isn't the big deal. What happens in peace is the big deal. You try to infiltrate your opponent's systems. You try to get into their companies. You try to get into their hardware, into their software. But it's all about being sneakier than the other guy. So that's the battlefield right now, and it's being fought in peace. Right now is the time that you're going to win or lose the next war. And the next major power war that we fight, the next major power skirmish we fight, is going to be won or lost in cyberspace, right? If you think about our hardware right now, it's more vulnerable to cyber infiltration than it is to any sort of hardware, regular military infiltration. The next war will be won or lost in cyberspace, and it will be won and lost right now, not after the bullets start flying. So that's the background. How do you fix this? What are some suggestions that we have, or that I have, that I would throw out on the table as things to think about? So I'll put out 4 very briefly. The first is we need to think more about deterrence and defense and preemption. We need to think about these things much more seriously, and these things are not, cyber is not about the Department of Defense. All of these things have to be done by whole of government. They have to be done by all of the organizations in government. This is not a DoD solution. This is a whole of government solution. If a country does something to us, we have to be willing to make it pay for it in such a way that it won't do it again. It might mean trade sanctions. It might mean a demarche. It might mean lots of things. But we've got to create a doctrine and a strategy for deterrence and defense in cyberspace. Second, we've got to solve this problem with lots of different organizations dispersing responsibility. We need one belly button for this, or at least a more centralized system. We need some sort of cybersecurity service, something maybe on par with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard protects our shores. Well, we need something that protects cyberspace. Some sort of Coast Guard centralized cybersecurity system or organization would be good. We need to increase our emphasis on intelligence, specifically directed at solving the cyber problem. We need to fund it better. And then, incredibly important, we need to cooperate more closely with our allies and countries that are willing to play by the rules. We need to make organizations and institutions which can work together to stop malefactors, people who are not willing to play fair and above board. We need to find a way to organize all the countries that are willing to play fair to try to stop the countries that aren't. And that's about what I've got. Thank you.
Going on your recent comments, the recent bill passed out of the Homeland Security Committee this past week was the reorganization of the National Protection and Program Director at the NPPD into DHS, creating a cybersecurity infrastructure and protection agency. Do you think that's, I mean, just to the panel, do you guys think that that's a step in the right direction? Are we heading towards what you're suggesting?
I would just very briefly say that it's a step in the right direction, but it's a very small incremental step. And it's not even going to begin to solve the problem. I applaud Congress for moving in that direction, but we'll need a lot more than that in the end.
So
You're allowed to just keep that on.
I'm never confident that just reorganizing is necessarily a solution, but I'll let that chapter unfold. I think that we have to identify other priorities and take action. There's a lot of conversation about what needs to be done, but little action. The whole topic we had earlier today, there's this big vogue conversation about information sharing, and a lot of people think that because CISA passed last year that we've solved that problem. And I think as we heard earlier today, it's a step, but it's just a step. And the fact still remains that the private sector has very little access to threat intelligence. The whole notion of enterprise risk management relies on an understanding of the threat environment as well as vulnerabilities and consequences. So improving upon this whole situation of the collaboration between industry and government is still unaddressed. And frankly, the whole CISA notion focuses more on industry sharing with government than it does with a exchange of information one to the other. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. In this particular case, I think it's a chapter yet to be written. We will see.
I think it's also worth taking a look at creating an independent cyber force. I'm not saying yes definitively. I think we need to do the research first. But speaking as a former Air Force, before it was cyber operator, culturally speaking, we're not going to attract the type of people, retain the type of people, develop the type of leaders we need in the current military structure. We need much more flexibility. We need the ability for people to enter and leave military service, not simply enter and then probably leave forever. The current reserve structure, while the reserve is great, it's not keeping or bringing in the types of people we need in the numbers that we need and in the duration of time that we need. It seems like almost every other country is figuring this out. The Chinese, the Russians, the Israelis, all the people we care about are creating their own cyber forces. We have a first mover advantage in creating the internet. We are going to be the last mover, I think, as far as creating the cyber force. But then again, we were the same way 100 years ago with air power. We had to rely on the French, the British, even the Canadians to train us how to fly to fight in World War I. So please, let's not repeat that mistake. Let's put some research behind whether or not we need an independent cyber force.
Can I add one additional comment?
Sure.
It struck me even in the conversations earlier today and even in this conversation here. You know, I think that most in our line of work would agree that thus far we've not experienced in this country a cyber event that we would consider one of national consequence. Today, and back to earlier comments, it's not clear by doctrine today when does such an event move from the domain of homeland protection to the domain of homeland defense. And it's not even clear to me that that debate is taking place. Now, maybe this caucus we heard about this morning may move us in that direction, but it seems like a debate we ought to be having before we experience an event so that we have clarity around what those lines of demarcation are and then the associated roles and responsibilities and the authorities that are necessary. Again, I use the example that if an attack were be coming to this country, detected to this country, and we are not even sure where it's coming from, but it's determined to be malicious, most of those attacks are going to come across networks that are owned, operated, or controlled by the private sector. And so if there's an action to be taken to try and interrupt that particular activity, then it's going to have to involve the private sector. What's the indemnification that's associated with that? What's the action that's expected in national defense? And these are the kinds of debates, to me, that are really important in terms of the long-term protection and resilience, not just here in this country, but around the world. And so I'm not sure what it takes to provoke that. I think this paper, this work that's been done here, goes a long way to helping plant the seeds to provoke that discussion and that dialogue. And we need to continue to build on that because those are essential debates that, at least in my knowledge, are not actively taking place as we speak.
So we get very mired in jurisdiction, especially here in the Capitol. But let's go back to the Coast Guard construct that's been kind of brought up both specifically and alluded to. So the Coast Guard has the ability to protect the nation's borders. So we'll say the networks. They have the ability to associate with the Department of Defense in time of war. And then we have the ability to board private vessels when needed. Then you also have an auxiliary entity, which is a little bit to what you're saying of being able to go in and go out. You have people that may have a previous history in this area and be able to not always have to be in the current Coast Guard to participate. I mean, is this something we should be looking at expanding that's not just so direct towards DHS or the way that maybe this bill is being a little too narrow? Any thoughts you guys want to go on that?
I like the Coast Guard construct. I also think if Coast Guard would be probably more defense-oriented and the cyber force would possibly be more offensive-oriented. But think about the Coast Guard for a second. We don't expect the Coast Guard to secure everything, right? There's probably a tendency to think that a cyber Coast Guard would be expected to protect us from everything. So let's not get stuck in that trap. There are certainly things that such a force could do. Let's define them or figure out what they would do and go from there and not have unrealistic expectations that the creation of such an agency would result in complete security.
Yeah, I would say a lot of times, when we have these discussions, people will look at the Department of Defense. They'll say, well, surely the Department of Defense, if things get bad, the Department of Defense will be there and they'll take care of it, right? If the lights go out, if whatever it is, the Department of Defense, you guys will take care of it. Well, no, right? First of all, the Department of Defense is not made for that mission. But secondly, you even talk about putting U.S. troops on U.S. soil, and the generals turn white, right? Because it's posse comitatus. This is imbued in our DNA that we don't do that in the United States. But the exception is the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is a DHS construct. It's not a DOD construct. everyone understands and accepts that the Coast Guard can do some of these things that the Department of Defense cannot, and the intelligence community cannot do. So the jurisdictional idea of a Coast Guard model is good, but I think we've come to a point that the threat is so serious, and it's not a threat of the future. It's right. Other countries right now, as the director of the NSA has said, have infiltrated into our electric grid. They're in a lot of our systems right now. They're deep in our systems. The threat, it's present. We need to find some way to get the government to get its act together, to centralize its responsibility, so someone can point to a certain organization and say, you guys are responsible for this. Don't let it go wrong. So yeah, I do like the Coast Guard idea.
And just briefly, one other consideration, the states have a role in this as well, because the governors have guard forces at their disposal, either Air Guard or Army Guard. So there's been a lot of work at those levels, and some of those units are better than the NSA units, because by day they're working for Microsoft and Amazon, and when they do their guard duty, they're putting on uniform.
So, may I ask?
Yes.
With my colleague?
Sure.
I've heard this conversation, and maybe this would be of interest. What would they do? I mean, that's what it's not clear to me. What would they do? I mean, if there's an event, and this kind of gets back to the conversation about the mosaic roles and responsibilities and who does what, and as much as there's this complicated network within the government, the question of where does the private sector owner-operator, critical infrastructure owner-operator community fit into the discussion when something bad is going on? I mean, I'm still, whether it's folly or not, I'm still a believer that we can get better at detection, prevention, and mitigation. But if something bad happens, who does what? And there seems to be some thought, and it might be right, that the National Guard would come in and be a part of it, or somebody else would be a part of it. And at least in my company or in the networks that we're involved in, I'm not sure I can see that happening in that manner. So maybe you guys have some thoughts that the audience would be interested in. Not to take over your role, sorry.
You're doing a great job. Keep going. Oh, apparently you're not, because they don't want to answer your question.
All right. It's just a problem with the mic here.
Okay, go ahead.
It's very complicated. You have to push.
Why don't you just
the
keep them
button.
on?
There's a button. And there's a light, too.
Look, well, you know, it's varied, right? What an organization could do will depend on the situation. So electric grids, for instance, right? Electric grids are many of them that are very vulnerable, and the vulnerability is the hardware, right? It's not such a fear that you're going to overload something and you're going to shut it down for a few hours or a day or two. It's that you're going to have an attack that will destroy the hardware, which can't be replaced for a period of months or in some cases years. So this is the sort of threat. Well, how do these companies know what the threat is? Because right now, I mean, I've done this many times. I've gone out and I've talked with the folks that are in charge of securing an electric transmission company or an electric generation company. The answer is, well, what threat? We don't understand the threat, and even if we did, what would we do about it? Well, how would they know what the threat is if nobody has told them that, yes, the North Koreans or the Iranians or the Chinese or some other country is infiltrating your system? And, you know, so here's the threat, here's what you can do to protect against it, and here's what you can do to respond afterwards to try to get your systems back up again. There's a lot of complex organization that needs to be worked out, and it has been worked out in certain parts of the country, in certain organizations, in certain government agencies that have figured out how you can respond, but getting that information where it's useful to the private sector so that they can make good use of it, finding out, you know, which parts of the private sector need that information, and then the legal responsibilities and the legal limitations on what can be done. All of those things are very complex and they're nuanced and they're different for every industry, sometimes every organization, and it just takes a lot of manpower to get in there and be able to affect these sorts of things. A lot of manpower and a lot of resources. So that's the sort of thing that the Guard could play an important role in, I think.
You might think that there's like armies of people out there who do cybersecurity who are just available for hire to do this work, or probably you don't. Maybe you prefer the hiring numbers. A good chunk of my company is Mandiant, and Mandiant is known for doing incident response. We only have about 300 consultants to hire. So assuming that we're doing no other work which is never the case. Pretty much every consultant is always fully booked. If we were to suddenly drop all of that, there's 300 people you could hire to work on some national catastrophe. When I think about other companies that are in this space, there are probably only 1,000, maybe 2,000 if you really stretch the definition of an incident responder. 2,000 people available to work on some national catastrophe. And remember that we would have to develop what we're going to do and coordinate on a scale that has never been seen before. So this is one of the reasons why I think we need to have these structures in place with people whose job it would be to help respond to these things. And that would only be in the disaster scenario. On a daily basis, they should be looking for threats, doing consulting work, and so forth. So this is, I mean, it's a wonderful question, and it is kind of a shame we haven't figured this out yet.
Well done, Deputy Moderator. So what about CISA? Did CISA help? Is it are we getting us on the right path for resolving some of these questions about indemnification and information sharing?
I'll throw out what I said before is CISA is helpful. It's a
Okay.
step in the right
All right.
direction. Great. But
Maybe that's where I heard that night.
it's a long journey, right? It's a step in the right direction. And getting it further, I mean, there's been a long history of wrangling in terms of who's going to pay the costs. And, look, nothing is free. There is always a cost to whatever you're going to try to do. And if you're going to try to share information between private companies and government private companies, there's going to be a cost to that. So it's a step in the right direction, but what we need is a great deal more sharing, and we need to create confidence, and you create confidence through good behavior. And that takes a track record, and the government's got to prove that it can do more than it's been doing in the past. And frankly, again, you see this in the private sector is there's a collective action problem, right? Nobody wants to give up their information, explain that they've been attacked, explain what their vulnerabilities are. They want other companies to do that, and then they'll benefit from the greater security for all. So how do you solve a collective action problem, right? I am genetically opposed to more regulation. It rubs me the wrong way. However, sometimes there are cases where you have to have some kind of regulation. Right now, in the electric power industry, NERC has stepped forward with voluntary and some compulsory regulations, but they're insufficient. Everybody knows they're insufficient. Somebody, and it's probably got to be Congress, has got to step in and create some common sense regulation that is going to overcome the collective action problem. All of our companies are going to be better off because the defectors, the companies that don't want to contribute, will even be better off if they have to contribute a little bit. What that contribution is going to be different for different organizations, different companies, and different interests. In some cases, it's privacy, right? That's a cost if you have to surrender some privacy. In some cases, it's the expense of greater regulation, right? I don't think it's large, but there is an expense to greater regulation. There's an expense to risking your trade secrets. There's all sorts of potential. These are complex issues that have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. But CISA is a step in the right direction, but we need to go a lot further.
We seem to be taking a lot of good baby steps around here.
So I'm going to push back on that because I think there's a private answer to this that doesn't require telling the government what's going on, and that is the insurance industry. So if you have an insurance policy, who is the entity that knows the most about a breach that you've had? It's going to be you, hopefully, any law enforcement you engage, your security provider, and your insurance company. Because to collect on your policy, you're going to have to tell them what happened, what the state of your environment was, all of that sort of thing. So the insurance companies are going to build up this huge knowledge base of every bad thing that's occurring and what works and what doesn't. And they're going to be able to guide better security because they'll say, look, you look like this, your policy premium is going to increase, or it's going to decrease because you've improved your security. The government doesn't have to have any role in that. Now, possibly they could mandate you have to have insurance in order to operate, but the government doesn't need to become this entity that knows what's happening. And by the way, the government knows a lot of what's happening. They're watching this stuff happen in real time in some cases, as Jeff mentioned earlier.
And I feel like I just need to make the point that what seems to get lost in this conversation is that the notion of operational capabilities and information sharing and analysis has been going on in the private sector for a long time. There's this thing called ISACs that seems to have gotten lost in the discussion here that emanated out of a presidential decision directive 63 in 1998. and industry sectors self-organized in a capability to be able to manage risk in their own sectors. And there's some uniqueness to each of the sectors, but there's a cross-sector provision that goes to that too. So there's a lot of work that's been done. And this report, again, talks about risk management and enterprise risk management and the need for an understanding of the economics and how that fits into the risk management process. So this has to be applied across the board, and we have to not just discount what's been working. We need to build on it. And for some reason, there seems to be reluctance at times in the government to learn from what the private sector does well and incorporate that into the approaches collaboratively going forward, and instead want to go out and invent something new. And that doesn't seem to me to be terribly productive, efficient, or timely in terms of the kind of risk we're talking about here in cyberspace. And again, this report drives home that conversation in a way that I hope people will pay attention to, because it allows us to leverage this good work that's been done and build on it and learn from it and make everybody better, including the government, in the process of that.
Last question from me. I can't speak for Bob, but then we'll open up for questions. Senator Gardner mentioned a select committee as a way to kind of manage through these jurisdictional challenges we have. Any thoughts on gathering all this into one space rather than these 140 different points of jurisdiction I think we have, and depending on what the issue is?
Yes, as someone who's testified, I think 13 times in 2013 when everything was really hot, because there were so many different committees, I would love to just go to one Senate select and then a House select version would be great.
So you could say the same thing 13 times to the same people, right? Anyone else? All right. Questions from the audience. Please identify yourself, and I think we'll have a microphone coming forward here in a second. There we go.
Hi, Ted Knudsen. I'm a freelance writer on assignment for Risk Professional magazines. I've been to a number of the congressional hearings on the OPM data breach. I've never heard anybody said that that data has actually been used. Asking all the panelists, have you heard that that data has been used? And if not, why go to the bother of collecting it?
It depends how you define used. In the sense that being monetized in underground markets, the indications I've seen are that it has not been used in that manner. In terms of being used for some type of intelligence operations, it's a little bit outside of what I work on these days. However, there was a similar incident involving Taiwan and their healthcare sector that was used to evict suspected Taiwanese spies from the Chinese mainland several years ago. I don't know if that's happening now for the equivalent, but there is some precedent there.
Another question in the back of the room. Got a microphone back there.
Thank you. Harrison Reeve from the American Foreign Policy Council. I was wondering, since we know many cyber attacks can come from not only foreign governments, but as well as independent actors in foreign countries, but these independent actors might also be contracted by their governments. How do you think would be best to react to attacks that come from these independent actors, and how can we discern whether these attacks are contracted by their governments or just maliciously intended by themselves? Thank you.
Not to necessarily promote another think tank, but several years ago, the Atlantic Council put out something they called, I think, the Spectrum of State Responsibility that Jason Healy or Jay Healy wrote. And it goes from, this is an attack that is conducted by in uniform, government-directed military or civilian equivalent forces, down to this simply took place on the soil, or it was originated on the soil of this country, and it's debatable whether or not there should be any action taken. So I think working through that spectrum is important. There are some norms which say that if it's coming from your soil, you're responsible. Like the UNGGE said that. Now, no one's paid any attention to it, but it was agreed to by the US, Russia, China, and other notable countries. As far as the whole issue of contractors, moonlighters, former government people, we see them all the time. Sometimes we can tell who they are individually. Sometimes we can tell that they're part of a crew. Sometimes we can tell that it is a government unit that was apparently asked by some other unit to do something weird, like steal electronic gold from a gaming site, and they're using military tools and tactics that we only see against nation-state targets. So it is possible, at least in the private sector, to do that, and I know the government forces can do that as well. Attribution is not as challenging as it was 5 years ago, especially at the DoD level. You can determine who is behind some of these, but you have to be willing to swing all of the different apertures of government on the problem. If it's a minor issue, no one's going to take the time because it's just a waste of resources.
I would just add to that this has become the method that every government uses now. I mean, cyber militias, right? It's just the way things are done. And you can a lot of times attribute it down to the computer from which the attack originated. That doesn't necessarily mean you can determine whether the government was responsible for the attack, unless the government was dumb enough to put their militia in a government building, which isn't real common. But what you have to do is you have to then say, all right, we track this back into your country. Now, if your government won't help us to locate and prosecute these criminals, then by assumption, they're working for the state. You can, I mean, it's a strong statement, but you can use that as a tool to get in there and then deter the government, hopefully, from using this method in the future.
One last question. Jeremy? Right behind you. Identify yourself.
I'm Jeremy Rapkin from George Mason.
Thanks.
Professor Andrus, I think, used the expression, but maybe it was Richard Balick, about preemption. And I'd just like you to elucidate, what would that mean? I mean, it seems like if you break their equipment, they can replace it. If you kill the operators, you're starting a war. So help us understand what preemption would mean in the real world.
I'll take a broad swat at that, and then maybe get into more detail. In cyberspace, in cyber conflict, if you wait until after you're attacked, it's usually all over. What you need to do is you need to be aware of what your opponent is planning before they do it. You need to be in their systems. This creates a security dilemma in which there is an enormous incentive for all sides to get into their opponent's systems as often as they can during peace. And, you know, like most security dilemmas, you might not like it. You know that it's bad, but you can't ignore it. Ignoring this sort of thing and not being proactive and trying to get into your opponent's systems is a recipe for disaster. You absolutely have to do it unless you can establish some sort of a norm in which two countries can agree in a verifiable way not to do it to each other, which is the best of all worlds. But until you can do that, you have to be preemptive and proactive. You cannot sit back and wait to be attacked without getting into your opponent's systems.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Within the next year or so, one of my fellow PhD candidates named Ben Buchanan from King's College London is publishing his thesis on the security dilemma, and he goes into all of that. You did a really great job of explaining it. In his thesis, he talks about some possible solutions to that problem.
All right, we have...
And? It's too much for here.
Right, can I get just a quick round, last thoughts or comments from any of you?
So I was remiss earlier, and I want to make sure I take the opportunity now to also thank and pay tribute to Mike Daniels for his leadership on this particular effort, but also as a pioneer in this industry, as a young guy who's still young today, and the leadership that he's provided across this industry for such a long period of time for so many of us. So thank you for that. On this topic here, let's just be reminded that something on the magnitude of 80 or 85% of critical infrastructures owned, operated, or controlled by the private sector. To the point that Jeff made earlier in terms of a leading army and a conforming army, we've got to get to a point in time collaboratively that the rhetoric meets the reality of public-private collaboration. I would argue today there's a huge gap there. There's a lot of talk about it. There's very little action on it. And in fact, in some cases, I think there's an intentional effort by some to disenfranchise the owner-operator community in the private sector. I'm hopeful going forward, and that, again, this report will help provoke further dialogue about having that rhetoric meet reality of the true public-private collaboration, because our nation is depending on us getting this right.
I'll just return to my 3 points from the beginning. First, think about the intruders that are already inside your organization. Is it someone's job to find them? If not, they're probably there and they've been there for a while. Secondly, if you can't protect it, don't collect it. Is there data that you could get rid of and hence rid yourself of some liability? And third, what would you do if your data was encrypted by someone and they forced you to pay in Bitcoin to get it back? Can you survive that? I know of several organizations that have survived it. They just had good backups. Others have paid seven-figure ransoms because they did not have good backups or a way to survive that situation. So plan ahead for all of those things and you'll come out better on the other side.
So I guess I have one Parthian shot. I would say that don't wait for a cyber Pearl Harbor, right? Everybody waits for a cyber Pearl Harbor, but the truth is, you know, if you looked at the total cost of Pearl Harbor, the actual real one, right, it would pale. It would be a fraction, a teeny fraction of what we lose every year due to foreign countries looting our corporations of what is the main thing the United States trades today, right? Mainly the United States trades information, intellectual property. But it's being looted on a scale which has never occurred in history before. If you added all this up, and I don't know what the actual cost is to the economy, if you looked at the National Security Agency's numbers, it's sufficient enough that it would be, our gross national product has been growing since the recession started at about 2% per year. And depending on how you look at it, about 1 or 2% of that growth is being taken out by intellectual property theft. That makes Pearl Harbor seem like nothing in comparison. Don't wait for some sort of flashy thing to blow up, right? Look what's happening every day. There's some very, very important geopolitically significant things going on. As we said, we're just not used to it. We're like the frog in the pot. As the heat keeps going up, we just get used to it. We don't notice it. That is the threat that's going on right now that we need to concentrate on, and that's the threat that we need to try to fix today. Thank you.
See why I love these guys? It's always a fascinating topic. So please help me and thank you, my panel.
I want to thank everyone for coming out this morning and sitting through a long morning's work. As you can see, there's a lot that has been done here. There's a lot that remains to be done. This is the initial report of the Global Internet Strategy Project. There is more to come, including another report later this year. So thank you all for being here, and we appreciate your attention and your time.